Welcome, everyone, to Open Betas, the podcast about the life of games, and sometimes the game of life. Today we have a very special guest with us in the studio. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Swimfan, and with me as always is Regal.
Hello.
All right, special guest is here today. I worked with this fellow for many years, and we also did things for fun that weren't work. He is a big shot game designer whose credits include League of Legends and some of their spin-offs, such as the card game League Legends of Runeterra and Project F, which is the upcoming action RPG, according to Google, right?
I you know as much as I do about that these days.
Okay. Also Darkspore at EA and Magic: The Gathering, the card game we talked about a couple episodes ago. Please welcome Paul Sottosanti.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So, Swimfan, why is every guest like a giga high-ranking, like senior lead director level individual? Don't you know any like rank and file normal people or?
No. I don't associate with the rabble usually.
Yeah, understandable. That's what I thought, but just
the suits upstairs, C-suite and up.
Sadly, I think this is a function of us getting older, Swimfan. But
I think it's just us being older. I mean, we know some younger people, and also when you're at a manager and a little older at the company, it's harder to make friends with the younger people. You know what I mean?
No, I know what you mean. I understand.
No, I agree. I always struggled to make friends with managers because I always felt like there was too much extra going on there. I found that awkward.
So let's talk a little about some of those games you worked on. Anything you want to bring up? But first, Paul, do you remember when we met?
Oh man,
I can't remember.
Okay, so I mean, obviously at Riot Games at some point.
I think there was a lot of crossover with some other friends who were on Bacon.
For sure.
Jeff.
I remember hanging out with you at Burning Man for one.
I guess that might have been the early time. Like the time I spent the most with you first was some Burning Man stuff.
Yeah, I think you had a really solid friend group that I had a lot of respect for, and and that was the first time I got to spend good, solid time with a lot of you, and then kind of start hanging out with you all after that. So
yeah.
Was that
anyway? I just wanted people to know we're cool. What's that? Was it expense? No.
It was a tax write-off, but not expense. The thing about being an entertainment is you can write off things like that sometimes.
Anything entertaining. All right, so tell us a little about your background, and if you want to talk about what you're doing now, we can talk about it a little bit now, and at the end we can plug your work.
Yeah, I mean these days I'm not working on too much. Working on some board game designs, but I don't, early enough that I don't need to talk about them.
Okay.
And I'm doing some freelance consulting as well, but nothing that's out on the market yet. But yeah, otherwise just enjoying life up in Bend, Oregon, where I live now. It's lovely here. And it sure is. As far as like how I got to here, it's a long road, I guess. The very early days I was kind of in this unique position of having two much older brothers. So my two brothers are 9 and 11 years older than me. So I was growing up in the 80s, and board games were still kind of coming into their own. Video games didn't even exist yet. And so when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I was playing. So I was being exposed to these board games that like were for 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And so the whole time I was just learning how to figure these things out from a really early time, and so pretty quickly I realized I really loved games in all forms.
Any of these games we would have heard of? Were these like war games or?
Yeah, it's funny. I played a lot of war games back then. I think that's just what was available. And these days I don't play war games at all. But my favorite game
with the little squares, the little cardboard squares.
Yeah, the chits. I never fully got into those. Axes and Allies was a big one. And then there's a board game called Titan, which was my favorite game back then. It's fascinating if you haven't played it. It's actually kind of famous for like theoretically being the reason that Richard Garfield invented Magic the Gathering. I think this is not a true story, but supposedly, so
That
basically,
sounds
Titan is
good.
yeah,
Sounds true.
Titan is infamous for having really long turns in the sense that when you get in a battle with another player, and there might be up to 6 players, the battle can take literally like an hour, and you literally leave the game board and pull out another board and have a little tactical battle,
Oh wow.
and everyone else has to wait. And so the story
So
goes that Richard Garfield invented Magic as something to do when other people are battling in Titan.
Interesting. Huh. I
But yeah,
believe it. I'm gonna say it's true.
yeah, I mean, there's probably some truth to it. Probably not the exact reason, but I know he played a lot of Titan back then, and so on and so forth. But yeah, so that was kind of my introduction to game design. Long before I knew game design was even a thing, was I love Titan. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, maybe even 11, I created an expansion to Titan that I called Titan 2, and I just built new terrains for the game. I drew all the art in a pixel paint program on the Mac,
Wow.
and I printed them all out, and I made tiles. I still have it actually to this day.
Oh, I want
So
to see
if you ever play
sometime.
Titan with me, yeah,
Yeah.
you can play this advanced version or whatever. But I was always really proud of myself for. I didn't power creep the existing game because
Oh.
I realized even at that age that I was adding terrains that were easier to access than the ones that are really hard in the core game, and so I made the
Mhm.
units less powerful than the ones you could get at the height of the real
Okay.
game.
Already balancing at
Yeah,
12.
yeah.
Is it?
So I was that was fun, and it was
Cool.
really cool to make that. And sort of
Yeah,
even
I'd
after that,
love to see it sometime. We should play.
we should. Yeah, totally. It's a great game. Most people struggle to sit down for a 6-hour game board game these days, but it's great.
I can do it.
So how did you get into the industry from the interest level or the hobbyist level?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I mean, going through high school, I always loved math, and eventually got into programming. We had an Apple II early on because my dad was into technology and my brothers were into games, so I was lucky in that sense. Um, we also had an Intellivision, which was a really early console, and we shared
yeah.
it with families around the neighborhood. So we would get it for 1 week out of every month, and it was a reason to like go to whoever's house had the Intellivision that week, which was pretty cool.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice neighborly thing to do.
And so yeah, I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and I did major in computer science. And I realized relatively quickly that I didn't actually love programming as much as I thought I did. I liked making things happen, and I liked making games, but I didn't love like programming operating systems or networking and things like that.
Were you already thinking games long term?
No, I didn't even. Yeah, again, I just thought games like appeared magically. Like I had no concept of this idea that like someone had to make it. I don't know why I was naive in that sense. Like
You
I
and
knew.
Reddit.
Yeah, yeah. It's so true. So yeah, I never thought about it as a career. No one ever mentioned it. It wasn't something you could study.
Oh, that's true. It wasn't. Yeah, I guess. So did programming was a useful skill you could bring anywhere, or what brought you there? Computer science.
Just being good at it and liking it.
Oh.
I mean, I guess I like being good at things like most people, and sort of like people reacted well. Yeah, I knew I was good at math, and it came naturally to me, and that translated well to programming. I was always really good around computers. Actually, before this, real quick, I made a website for Diablo that actually became kind of a big deal. So basically, like, I made this website. It was a fan site. I was playing a lot of Diablo, and then eventually Diablo 2 got announced, and I converted the website over to that. And there was a custom database for like looking up all the random loot and everything. And so I was enjoying.
I wonder if I used it. What was it called?
So originally it was called Yeag's Tavern.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I actually delayed changing my handle to Yeag until my website was dead because it felt weird to like name the website after me. I just like the word anyway. And then actually the people who own Diablo2.com reached out and contracted me to put my website there. So if you ever went to Diablo2.com at the right time, you would have used it.
Interesting. I probably did.
And then I actually made $1,000 a month. I think it didn't last very long, but for like someone of my age, which was like 16 at the time, and back in like the late 90s, that was pretty sweet.
With selling ads, or what was? Honestly, where did the money come from?
It's a good question. I don't even know how they made money.
Just
somehow
loot.
They were
converting.
They sold loot. Yeah, I guess banner ads. Somehow they were converting traffic into into money, and then I got a big cut of it.
Okay, so when'd you get into the game industry? How'd you get there?
Yeah,
What was your break-in?
So because of that website, I actually got invited by Westwood Studios, who are famous for Command and Conquer.
Oh yeah, I was a fan. Kyrandia.
Yeah, they flew me out to Vegas to check out their latest game, Nox, and I was like treated like royalty. It was amazing. They put me with the Luxor. I was like 17 years old still. It was crazy. It was
wow.
Yeah.
That's the pyramid one.
Wait,
Right?
this was before you went to college, right?
17.
Yeah, we stepped back slightly in time. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
And then, so that all happened. And so I had some context of Blizzard, and I had some context of Westwood, but even then I still didn't think about it. Just seemed like a far off thing. I didn't know anyone who made games. And so it didn't seem practical that I would do that, which is weird in hindsight. But so anyway, yeah, kind of at the same time, I was getting really into Magic the Gathering, and I was starting to play in tournaments. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon, which is kind of famous in the Magic world for having something called Team CMU, which is a bunch of high-powered Magic players, many of whom went on to work at Wizards of the Coast, actually, and some of whom still work there 20 years later. Yeah, so I was playing a lot of Magic, and once I reached out to those guys who were at the same college as me, they started inviting me to tournaments, and so I started flying around the country to play in Grand Prix. I started flying around the world to play in Pro Tours occasionally, and then so I was playing a lot of Magic, but again, I just still didn't think anything of it. I graduated from school.
Wait, hold on. I'm interested in this. What era of Magic was this? What were the sets that?
Oh man. So gosh, this was 2000, 2001.
Oh, 2001. So like Mirrodin?
Yeah, a little bit before that. I started working at Wizards when Darksteel was coming out. So Mirrodin was actually, people who work at Wizards talk about like I forget the term for it now, but it's like their blank set or their dark set. And it means that like when you join Wizards, suddenly your worldview shifts forward like 6 months or a year because you join the FFL. And then like you just
I see. Okay.
a set that is coming out right then. You just like never get to experience it.
Oh, interesting.
And like Mirrodin and Darksteel were kind of that for me. And then the first thing I did at Wizards was like contribute to the discovery of Skull Clamp, and we all realized how broken it was, and that was the whole thing. And then I also contributed to designing Umezawa's Jitte, which is a whole other thing.
Anyway. Have you to blame.
It actually, yeah, I could tell that story if it's relevant at some point in this conversation. But yeah, I am actually kind of the person to blame for.
So I actually got one of my formative stories was I went through like a 3-step process to like trick my parents into letting me go hang at GameStop and trading some old games I hustled from my friend I was actually originally trying to buy Advance Wars, but I didn't have enough store credit because GameStop like robbed you. So instead I turned my store credit into one of the Darksteel pre-mades.
Oh man, okay.
And yeah, that was not my introduction to Magic, but that was the first Magic cards I ever bought. So I own like 4 copies of Skull Clamp. Too bad I destroyed them because I was like 14, because they're like $15 now at least. So.
Oh yeah, I'm sure probably maybe more. Let me tell you, I had a lot of fun playing with Skull Clamp in FFL. That card was right up my alley in terms of just drawing tons of cards with lots of cheap creatures.
What's FFL short for?
Good question. Future League. Yeah, it's basically where people test the future formats like a year in advance.
Okay.
And it's like a bunch of really strong Magic players, not always, but mostly, who play against each other and kind of record the results and then change cards based on that.
And the reason I know that is I obviously never worked at Wizards, but my introduction into game design as a concept was actually Mark Rosewater's column called Making Magic. As a kid, I just like had nothing to do, so I just read the Magic, what do they call it, the mothership articles a lot, and that was just one of them. And I didn't really realize until like 10 years later that those were like weird game design articles that were hard to find and really not something I just took them totally for granted, but they were
Mark is a design treasure for writing those articles day in day out for like 15 plus years. Every once in a while people reach out to me and are like, oh, you're in an episode of Driving to Work, that Mark Rosewater's podcast, he talks about you. And I haven't really, I think I looked at one of them at some point, but there's a bunch of random tidbits about me out there somewhere.
We'll almost certainly talk more about Magic when we get into RNG.
Oh, yeah.
But what comes next?
Yeah, so that does lead into what's next, which is basically, well, after Carnegie Mellon, I got a job at this place called CombineNet. It was basically like a bidding site for Fortune 500 companies to bid for shipping routes. And I was the only person at the company. I was a programmer, but I was the only one interested in UX. And so I basically designed all the interfaces for that. And
okay.
meanwhile, yeah, it was a really interesting job. And then basically there was this black box piece of software written by a CB professor, which would take in all these really complicated bids and then spit out an answer that would save these companies like millions or tens of millions of dollars. So they really liked us.
Yeah.
So
Makes sense.
there was decent
I like
money in
this.
that. Yeah. And so anyway, and obviously I was still playing Magic during that time. And at some point it came across my desk that there was an internship on Magic opening up. And so I figured why not apply. And I did not get the job, but it came down to just the final two people, and I was super close. And they liked me enough that they offered me a different but similar internship working on non-Magic card games. And the internship went to a guy named Matt Blaze, who I was later roommates with, still talk to occasionally. But so then I basically faced a fork in the road because I was also really into graphic design, and at CombineNet I was starting to be respected for my graphic design skills, and they were starting to partner with this really good firm. Yeah, this really strong firm in Pittsburgh that was also like highly recognized for graphic design, and they were going to embed me at this firm, so I was going to represent our company's interests to them and basically be the go-between and like work with them to design our logos and our sites and everything. So that was like an incredible graphic design opportunity. And then at the same time, I got this internship opportunity, which would require taking a 50% pay cut and moving across the country from Pittsburgh to Seattle.
Yeah.
And I did not own a car. So I'd also have to buy a car to get all my stuff there. So yeah, I mean, you probably can guess that I took the game design job and ended up working at Wizards. So I drove.
Was it just the love of the games? Is that it?
It was a tough call, honestly, because I loved both. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was just like rolling the dice. Not that I'm like a gambler, really. Yeah, I was just like, it felt like it had a higher upside on my like eventual life goals, and just like it seemed like it was hard to turn down the idea of working on games for a living. I really love games, so the idea
and
that
if you hadn't made that decision, you wouldn't be here on this podcast.
So. Totally, everything would be absolutely completely different.
That shows it was the right choice.
Yeah, I just bought a car, loaded everything into it, drove 3.5 days straight, basically, and started work like the morning after. I think I pulled into the parking lot at like 10 p.m.
So I want to keep things moving. So what came out actually after Wizards? I don't want to get too much more into Wizards at the moment.
Yeah, so after that was Maxis. I ended up working on a game called Darkspore, which was most people have not heard of. Everybody's heard of Spore. Most people don't know what Darkspore is. I really hated the name when they proposed it, and I still hate the name to this day. So I feel like obviously that wasn't the only thing wrong with the game, but that was one of them.
So it's like anyway, a Spore spinoff?
It was an action RPG that was inspired by the Spore creature creator. So the idea was that you would have total customizability of what your characters looked like, and you could just create these incredibly cool monsters by finding like laser cannons out in the world and then putting them onto your creature in the creature creator, and everybody would look totally unique and you'd feel really invested in your character. And so, yeah, long story short, I became the de facto lead designer for that game. In some sense, I was the only designer on it. And so I did almost everything. I designed the loot system from scratch, which is like an affix-based RNG system. So that will be relevant later. I designed the AI director. I designed all the character abilities and all the enemies and the difficulty scaling and the squishing for when you wanted to play with your friends. We would squish your gear so you could play it, even if you were at very different power levels. Same with PvP. We would do that too, so on and so forth. So.
What caused you to make the jump to this unknown project, essentially?
It's a great question. Hard to get into that too much without talking a lot about Wizards, but I was getting a little frustrated with various things there. I kind of had gotten tired of working on Magic for a few reasons, and I had moved over to digital games at Wizards, and I had some big successes there in like the Facebook social game space. But Wizards as a whole was still trying to figure out digital games, and they were really struggling for a number of reasons that I can get into maybe.
This is the MTGO era, right? Or like even before? Okay.
Arguably like right before. I remember MTGO becoming a big thing. No, actually, sorry. This is after, MTGO was already around when I was in college. So MTGO had been up for a while.
For all the success that Magic Online did have, it does definitely seem like they dropped the ball on the
MTGO is a piece of
It's
Hot
terrible.
garbage.
It's I remember when I started working at Riot, you looked at the digital card game space and was looking at Magic Online. I was like, do I have the right program? Like, is
I mean,
this correct?
as someone who's interested in UX, I'm sure it offended you on even more levels than it offends
Yeah.
me. But
So everything you guys are saying is true, but I will say that in 1999 or 2000,
true.
when it originally came out, it was actually kind of revolutionary. Like the fact that
Yeah.
I could sit in my dorm room and draft Magic,
The
and
fact that
like,
it worked, yeah.
yeah,
I
the
think
graphics
I think
didn't look dated at that point, and so on and so forth. But
I think for an era between like 1999 and like 2008, it was great. And then from like 2008 until,
Yeah.
well, I guess it's still used today, but at some point it became turbo outdated. And
yeah, the really TLDR of that is that like the company that originally made it were actually huge Magic fans and great programmers. They just like knocked it out of the park in a lot of ways, and then eventually Wizards decided to bring it in house.
Yeah.
And save the money on paying them, and then it really fell off a cliff
I've
after
heard,
that, I would say.
obviously this is from external sources, but yeah, I've definitely heard variants of that.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, so I was kind of frustrated with a lot of that stuff. Yeah, I guess the really TLDR on the Wizards thing was Hasbro gave Wizards a huge sum of money and were like, bring us into the digital age. And Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, so they basically gave it to Wizards and said, you figure this out. And yeah, we tried to make a thing called GleeMax, which was a social network for gamers, and then we were going to publish indie games, kind of like Devolver does now or whatever.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of ways Wizards was ahead of its time, but like they did a bidding process where they kind of like took the lowest bid from business software companies that didn't know how to build games, and it all just kind of fell apart eventually.
Damn. Okay.
Yeah.
So you had to move on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I got roped into Maxis, which I was excited about that project. It was really cool to work on an action RPG, especially.
Well, it sounds like you got a lot of experience there too, if you're the de facto designer.
Yeah, I worked on basically everything a designer could do for the whole game, which was really, really cool. You rarely get that amount of, like, I guess, sway on a game's design when you're working at a company with that many resources, and it was owned by EA at the time even as well.
Wait, it's no longer owned by EA?
Say again?
It's no longer owned by EA?
No, I'm just saying I think it already was owned by EA.
I see, got it.
Still is as well, but I think back then they had their own office. I don't think they do anymore, so it's a little bit closer to the vest now, but yeah.
I suddenly got a bunch of hope for The Sims 5, but now it's back to...
Sorry to dash.
Now it's back to where it was.
I didn't know you were a Sims guy, Regal. I guess we did play that GBA Sims game.
That's a whole nother story.
Okay.
That's a long tangent. Let's move on.
That'll be another episode.
I play a lot of The Sims.
Okay, yeah. So after Maxis, I took some time off and tried to figure out what the next thing was. And I think most people who joined Riot Games early in League's career or whatever have a similar story, which is they were playing the alpha or they were playing the beta a lot, and they were really enjoying it and thinking it did a lot of really cool things. And I knew some people from Darkspore who had gone to Riot. Two of the main people behind Darkspore, in fact, had left for Riot, and they had a lot of respect for me as a designer because of kind of how much weight I carried on Darkspore from the design side. And so they reached out and were kind of pushing at me to like, hey, come to Riot. And eventually I was like, yeah, I don't see a good reason not to. And I moved to LA. And yeah, then I was there. I mean, I was at Riot for almost 10 years with some sabbaticals, and then eventually I ended up working part-time for the last year and a half or so. But yeah, it was a long journey there.
Yeah, almost 10 years. Holy moly. That's a lifer.
Yeah, sort of. I don't know if I quite give that one to Jeff.
Pretty short life, but
short but good. Short but sweet. So just give us an idea of what kind of gamer you are. What are some of your top favorite video games out there?
No, it does not do video games.
Okay, games. Fine. Let's say do you have like a top 3 or anything that come to mind? You don't have to know exactly. But.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be. Oh, sorry. I guess you're about to answer, but it doesn't have to be like particular ranked or criteria. Just share what your favorite games are and like why they made an impact on you or whatever.
Yeah, so favorite board game is an easy one. Real quick, I'll get that out of the way. It's Time Stories. It's a cooperative game. It's actually designed by someone from Ubisoft, which I find so fascinating.
What's your favorite board game? Time Stories is?
My favorite board game of all time. I love.
We need to play more.
Yeah, I agreed. It's so good. I still have a few scenarios I haven't played yet. Yeah, so these days I really love cooperative games. That wasn't always the case, but as I've gotten older, I've kind of come around to that. I don't get as much joy out of competing at like a really high level as I used to.
Nope.
Um, yeah, seriously, washed up really.
Get good.
Uh, video games, man. I was literally just talking to our friend Yotam recently about this, and he reminded me of a game that is my favorite video game, and now, of course, I can't think of it.
Oh,
If it comes to me later, I'll bring it up. Otherwise, I mean, I've put all of kind of the classic games, like obviously Diablo 2. I play a lot of auto battlers these days, so I play Hearthstone Battlegrounds is still my go-to. I play a lot on the Peloton when I'm working out. It's like I need to shut my brain off and not think about how much pain I'm in right now.
yeah. That
Thing
works
that I do. It's perfect for that. And I think auto battlers are essentially like RTSs for older people, basically people who don't want the like true Twitch skills anymore, but still want strategic gameplay.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should try some. I haven't played any of it.
I just started playing this game called Backpack Battles, which isn't even. It's the release date is April 24, so like it's 6 months out from release, but it has a free demo on Steam. And I almost never play demos, but I saw someone playing on Twitch randomly, and like it's really fun already.
What's it called again?
Backpack Battles. It's a inventory management auto battler. So you are managing your inventory and putting swords and stuff in there, and then arranging them optimally, and then you hit go. And it uses a thing that Super Auto Pets pioneered, which is like asynchronous matchmaking. So you're not actually playing against someone live. You can queue at 3 a.m. and it'll pull someone's inventory from the past that they submitted at an earlier time and match you against them. So you are playing against a human, but not a real-time human who's sitting there at that moment.
All right. I'm gonna try this. This looks good.
So, yeah. So yeah, I love games like that. What else? I mean, I had my shooter phase. I played a lot of Apex Legends with friends. Played a lot of Modern Warfare 2 way back in the day before they like started using those same numbers again.
That's funny. I wonder if we ever played or if we were ever matched together.
I bet we did. I bet we played at least once.
I played a lot of Modern Warfare 2.
Nice. It was so good. I love that game. Obviously,
do you have any? Oh,
good.
I was just thinking, do you have any games that gave you a new perspective, a new idea, influenced you in some way?
Oh man, so many. I'm the kind of designer that like a lot of designers. I shouldn't say that. Some designers try to hide their influences because I think they're a little bit worried that they'll be called out for kind of imitating or stealing ideas. But I'm the opposite. I'm like, whenever I design a game, I'm usually like very upfront about like, oh, this was inspired by that. This was inspired by this other game. Like I find that so many good designs are out there that do things that work really well. So like, please don't reinvent the wheel or don't feel like you need to hide that you are copying the wheel because there's so many other places you can sort of iterate. And like I find it's better to start with something that's like 80% known good and then try to make the 20% that you're going to change really awesome rather than try and change everything and like not really know where you're going.
If you're hiding it, I mean, it's just kind of bullshit anyway. If we don't acknowledge that the work before inspires the work now,
totally.
Any art,
Yeah, and often it's being transparent anyway because it's like people can tell, and there's no shame in it. I think. I remembered what my favorite video game is. Disco Elysium.
You did say that was your favorite. I'm gonna play that soon.
It's so good.
It sounds everyone raves about it.
Yeah, I really, really love that game. It came out of left field for me, but it's just so well done. I find.
Leftist to field.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's such a fascinating story and kind of with a sad ending, but as far as like what happened to the company and so on. But I feel like it's in many ways it's a game that like only could have been made in Eastern Europe, and it's like so fascinating. It's such a really cool. It's like a great example of how bringing more diversity into video games makes for better games overall. Because like 10, 15 years ago, it would have been really hard for a company from Eastern Europe to like break onto the global market, but these days it's totally possible.
Yeah, it is great. There's so much we haven't seen yet out there. All right. So that brings us up to today, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us to talk about the magical RNGs, random number generators, and how they make games better? ? We'll find out right after this break.
What? We don't have breaks.
We're back,
What's happening?
and we're back.
Someone stop this man. Going off the deep end.
You want
So-
to? Go
so-
ahead, Regal.
So RNG, when the proposed topic was, was basically like the function of RNG, I felt like that was very broad, and in many ways, kind of like the applications can be quite obvious, right? At a basic level, depending on the situation. But for example, if we take the first example I want to get into, luckily we both have played a lot of Magic, is the role that drawing a card each turn has in Magic, and I think at a high level that can be quite obvious. So the way I wanted to structure this conversation is to first obviously go over what the actual functions are, but I wanted to present a bunch of case studies for us to talk through. The first one being drawing one card per turn in Magic, or drawing a limited amount of cards per turn in Magic, and what that does. And then I want us to explore, without any particular destination in mind, what would happen if we dramatically increase the variance, dramatically decrease the variance in these situations, and how that would break the existing paradigm, and what avenues that could potentially open up, depending on the situation. So basically just spitballing about specific scenarios and applications, and seeing where it goes, and get into
Sounds
or
good
tangents
to me. But
per section, I assume.
let's cover the obvious shit too.
Yeah,
First.
of course.
Yeah.
So the first one, what is the point? This is sort of this is like in a 101 class, right? The question that would start the lecture, which is why would you bother building a deck when you can only play 20% of it per game? I'll let you give the answer here. Like what
Me or Paul?
why should I only get to play 20% of my deck per game?
This is for
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, this is, of course.
I pass.
So yeah, one of the really kind of important things that RNG brings to the table for games is variability and experience. So if you are playing obviously like a fixed deck of cards against your opponent, and like I guess the easiest example, or the sort of toy example, is like Richard Garfield and his friends would say, would be like you're playing War with a deck that is sorted, a certain way, and it's like everything's deterministic. There's no randomness or variability in the outcome, and it's like that might be fun once, especially if you get to like choose your deck and you choose how you organize it. But then every time you play against that same person again, the outcome is the same unless you go and change your deck. And so, games get a lot of variability and sort of like replay value through introducing RNG.
And I think
Yes.
at a high, although I guess we should define some terms. So RNG stands for random number generator or generation, which is the technical implementation level term. But when people say RNG, what they often mean is like randomness as a concept, as it applies to games. So for example, there's no RNG, technically speaking, in drawing a card, like shuffling your deck. There's no generator, but it's randomness, right? And a similar, but not exactly the same term is variance, which is like the amount of game effect that a particular outcome has based on the randomness. So a game that's very high variance, the random effect has a very large impact on the outcome, whereas a game that's very low variance, for example, like Critical Strike in League of Legends is very low variance because it's more the effect of one individual critical strike is not that high in the vast majority of cases. It's more about the overall, depending on the situation, obviously. But in general, compared to poker, where the effect of one card is a complete win or loss, the effect of one critical strike is much slower, so the variance can be defined to be low.
Yeah, and RNG is also it's very close to, but not exactly luck. I mean, you can think of it as the luck that plays into whatever game you're playing. Did I get a bad draw or a bad roll? Or was I lucky and won?
There is some correlation between our randomness and luck, but it's not always, one does not always cause the other.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting way of looking at luck that hopefully I'm not misquoting him, but I think can be attributed to Richard Garfield, which is basically that he defines luck essentially as anything which contributes to uncertainty of outcome. And that's a really wide definition of luck because it covers a lot of things that you might not think of as being lucky, but it's things like
what your opponent does.
Luck of war.
Yeah, so like, and by this definition, there's still a significant amount of luck in games like chess and StarCraft because it's things like who you're paired against that round, the variance in your mental conditions that day. Like, did you sleep well? Did they sleep well? Which openings your opponent decided to use that day is like essentially random to you, even though it's a decision for them. And then
Right.
whether you've practiced against those openings recently could totally change if you're going to do well or bad, poorly against them. So in a lot of sense, like going into especially a tournament of a game that has no RNG or no luck on the surface still has quite a bit of uncertainty of
Yeah.
outcome, which can be attributed to, in some sense, luck.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the words I like to use here is skill correlation, as in how much does the difference in like some kind of measurable skill between your opponent, assuming this is a competitive game of some kind, contribute to you winning. And luck is sort of the opposite of that, where luck is the thing, not necessarily from randomness, from any of those factors that we just mentioned. Luck is the thing that can overcome the skill gap, and the amount that luck affects the outcome of a game is sort of variance, right? Or is the variance level of the game. So for example, chess is a game with very high skill correlation, very low variance. Even though there are factors that can affect your outcome, even if you play a completely unknown, well, there's no unknowns anymore, but a completely surprising opening against someone who's 300 points higher than you, you are unlikely to win, right? Because the correlation is so high. But in StarCraft, which is also a very high skill correlation game, if you cheese an opponent, they're not ready for it, you are in many ways likely to win, right? If you pick a builder and so on and so forth. Until some extreme examples like poker, where
I mean, these things smooth out that skill gap a little bit, right? Or like connect it a little bit so that dumbasses can win sometimes and really great people can lose sometimes.
That is one of the examples, but I think it's also not the main reason.
It is the reason, though, I would argue that the games that tend to become really popular family board games often have quite a bit of variance and quite a bit of luck. So Monopoly being the classic example, and it's kind of been replaced by Settlers of Catan in a lot of ways, but also a game that's highly random and a lot, someone who doesn't play as well can just happen to roll their number over and over and over again and just win because they got a lot of stuff, even though they didn't quote unquote deserve it.
You don't deserve that free parking.
In a similar way, I mean, like slot machines being what they are as an entertainment object is sort of similar, right? Or casino games in general, where you don't need to have, in fact, you can't have any skill at all. You get kicked out if you have any skill. But people are attracted to the ability to win based purely on luck, essentially.
Yeah, our brains really tune into unexpected events. It's like definitely slot machines show that. It's also something I find really interesting about spectating in games, in video games in particular, is like spectators enjoy things more when there's a lot of unexpected outcomes and twists, and that often is driven by RNG. Not always. There can be moments of high tension in League of Legends, for example, where someone's waiting in a bush and they ambush, they set up a gank. The fact that the spectators know that that's coming, that's also really entertaining. So there are other ways to find entertainment in spectating, but I find that like the RNG and the sort of random outcomes drives a lot of it. That key crit that kills someone where they otherwise would have died is super exciting when it does happen in League of Legends, which is rare but can happen.
Yeah. So you insert the right variance into your game, you're making it more exciting to watch.
Which is something that like I find sometimes game designers undervalue these days, because spectating is becoming such a big part of the ecosystem. And like I think it's really important to design your game with spectating in mind, but I think a lot of people still focus more on the player's experience, which is obviously important too, but taking both of them into account and thinking about like what the overall experience of interacting with this game is useful these days.
And I wonder how many people these days learn about new games, hear about new games from just watching somebody, right? Like,
Totally.
I just don't know that data anymore. Twitch and YouTube stuff.
That's why I'm playing Backpack Battles. But anecdotally, I mean, it's like when a game takes off on Twitch, it seems to have a huge effect on like the number of people talking about it and the sort of zeitgeist and the number of reviews it's getting on Steam and everything. So I think it's really, really common.
Yeah.
I wonder how sticky that effect is, because you can optimize for that with ads, right? Essentially. And I think obviously viewers are savvy enough to be able to tell whether they're really interested in something or whether it's just put in front of them as an ad. But
wait. Could you say that again? I didn't follow you.
As in, like, you can force your game to get a bunch of traction on Twitch through ads, right, and get a bunch of viewers.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
But
Get 'em
I
in the door
wonder,
anyway.
yeah, I wonder what the forces in that are like. Because on one hand, just having a viewer see it, and for a certain type of viewer, just having flashy colors and effects is enough to get them interested in the game. But on the other hand, I wonder if that's actually a good long-term ROI, essentially, for
Oh, sure.
many different types of games.
Yeah, I mean the ad gets you in the door, but the game that you see or the personality with it is what is sticky, like you said. It gets you staying and interested in the game.
Yeah,
And
I
there's
think
very few people that would just be like, "Oh, I saw an ad, so I'm going to buy it," unless my
Yeah,
friends are
Well,
buying it.
I mean, you work in marketing. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, but
I think
I
generally
mean,
gamers are smart
kind
enough
of. I
to.
mean, it depends. Like,
yeah,
if if you're talking about like an online ad, it's a lot of the time it's just like awareness and excitement more than
right.
persuasion.
I think
So
it
yeah,
actually
but
kind of harkens back to what Vega was talking about in that episode, where he was saying mobile games are very much driven by just like getting people in the door, and then like some of them will stick, and you're happy with that because mobile gamers aren't thinking as deeply about like, is this an amazing game? They just want a time distraction or whatever.
yeah,
When
I
they're,
might be like literally in line for something and just like, all right, whatever, I'll just play this.
but I think
Which
PC
is
and console gamers are more
Thanks for
savvy and really
listening to
want.
Open Betas with Vagar,
Yeah, no problem.
even though I lost most of his stuff.
That's all right. I enjoyed what
well,
was there.
don't
I'm
take.
taking the
Oh,
blame.
okay. All right. We can take the L on this one. Yeah, I wanted to follow up something like after that discussion with Vagar, I had a lot of thoughts about like the how you can get a mobile game to be sustainable, if that's even possible. Because right after that game, like one of the most popular games shut down, or not, I guess not one of the most popular, but a game that had a huge advertising budget and was like ostensibly successful because of it shut down in the West. And yeah, it made me
Which
think
is
about
what
like
game?
Princess Connect Redive.
Okay.
Anyway, it has a massive advertising budget. It has like a whole anime and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it made me. That's kind of what led to this question in the first place. Is that it made me think about like, to what extent does getting people in the door actually help your game succeed past 3 months, right? 6 months, if you don't have something. I want to say something of substance, but that's not exactly a useful thing to say, right? But if there's not
Yeah, I
something
mean, you
that
can
keeps people
keep
in it for
pumping
some
people
reason.
into the system with ads, right? Like you can keep paying
Yeah, but
for getting people in, but if you don't if those people don't have a reason to tell anyone else about it or to come back, that it's
right.
it's very limited.
Like
Yeah,
ads have to have a diminishing return, right? Because at some point people see the ad for the second time and it doesn't work anymore, right? Like it has to
yeah.
be
I think you can only keep that up for so long, and like to your point, like the game needs to be uh,
here's one.
designed well enough to keep them once they're there, because uh, eventually, yeah, you're gonna run out of new people to kind of like deceive or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Swimfan's the name, by the way.
Okay, back on topic. So I think that we were talking about why you only why you only ever play 20% of your deck in Magic, right? And I think the one of the most important aspects of randomness in games is that ability to create novel experiences. There's very few games. I could think of one example, but there's very few games where you either don't play with another human, and when you play with another human, often the other human provides the not randomness per se, but the variance in experience, right? Because they come back with a new idea, or they come back having practiced some more, and you have a new experience versus them, right? And there's also like a social construct. But if you're having a single player game or something like that, especially something that's meant to be re-experienced, that variance is a big driver in having a game be replayable or even like continuously playable past the first time you experience it, just so you can have just so you can see something new. I mean, I think that's fundamentally when you play a game, that's often one of the biggest motivating factors, that you want to see something new, and not
Yeah,
just do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I think designing replayable single-player experiences has been a classically difficult design problem for a long time, and I think like that's in many ways why roguelites have become so popular these days, because it is a relatively accessible from the design perspective and the production perspective way to make your single-player game
That's a good
have
answer. Yeah.
legs. But yeah, it's a really hard problem. Like unless you do what we call the content treadmill, where you're just constantly pumping out new things for people to see, which is really hard to keep up with how quickly players can consume content.
Yeah.
You're going to struggle to make a game that people are going to want to play more than once.
That's
without-
sort of that example is actually sort of exactly to the point, right? Because when a player finishes a let's say like a like a Fire Emblem game, right? And they reach the end, but they want to keep playing. The only in-game content that's sustainable, unless you keep adding new content, is some kind of random effect. So like Diablo 3 had like greater rifts, right, which are basically just procedure generated dungeons that like the numbers keep going up. But all the endgame
that's
content
almost
sort of
like
recycles.
that's like their prestige mode or their new game plus almost. It's just like you keep going, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. Darksport did something like that. I mean, Diablo 2, I guess. I don't know. I can't remember if 3 did this. Had Nightmare in Hell difficulty levels where you play through
Yeah.
the story again,
Right.
but just like everything's harder. Darksport inspired by that. We did that, but we also I wanted to amp it up a little bit, so we built some tech that like it's not just numbers going up, but like behaviors are changing. So they would actually swap out to different AI behaviors, and they would start using like homing projectiles. Actually, sorry, in the second difficulty level, they would start leading their shots. So they would calculate your momentum, and wherever you were going to be, they would shoot there. So you had to start dodging, weaving a lot more. And then at the final level, they would actually start homing their shots with like a little bit of a curve. So it'd be like they're leading you and it's curving towards you. So now you really need to find some sort of defensibility or dodge really well.
Huh. Yeah.
So,
no, go ahead.
Oh, so in Magic, in this specific example, the reason it's helpful to only let the players see, I estimate 20%. I think that's more or less correct. But a small portion of their deck is that they can then play that same deck against the same deck over and over again for a long time and get new, fresh experiences and basically retain interest, right?
Yeah, there's that statistic that has like continually blown my mind ever since I heard it, which is that like, the number of different ways to shuffle a deck of playing cards is like as many as are atoms in the universe or something. It's like some absurdly large number, and it's like, yeah, it's crazy. So it's like relatively unlikely that like you'll ever see the same. I mean, it's like extremely unlikely you'll ever see the same shuffle of a single deck of playing cards in your lifetime, because it's just numbers get out of hand really quickly when you multiply 52 by 51 by 50 by 49 and so on.
Anytime you take something to the exponent. I guess this is a core computer science principle as well. Anytime you take something to an exponent, numbers quickly exceed what you can calculate reasonably.
Is this 52 factorial with the exclamation point?
52 factorial.
Yeah, so with 60 cards in a Magic deck, it's like even more. Like now you're multiplying.
Of course, there are more duplicates in Magic, so it's not.
That's true.
But regardless, it's. And so that, in addition to variant or raw randomness, complexity, as indicated, they can also introduce new experiences, right? So, for example, chess. In chess, grandmasters almost every game. I think at least the majority of games. I think almost every game reaches a fresh position at some point, unless they're making a pre-arranged draw or something like that, right? Like at some point, even though all the information is known, that there have been millions, maybe tens of millions of games played in the database. Almost every game reaches a new unknown position that has never been reached before, and that's not an outcome of randomness. It's an outcome of complexity, right? But I think one of the gaps between the two examples is that when you don't have the randomness, it's like playing the game of war, but you have to meticulously plan out your whole deck. In chess terms, that's you have to study and memorize your openings in order to play the game at some level, right? You very quickly have to just start putting in book work and study work in order to compete. Whereas when it's purely random, you can sort of react to what's in front of you and not have to go through that whole layer of planning out every possible scenario as far as you can to the human limit.
Yeah, the designers of Hearthstone wrote a really good article back in the day when people were starting to get to the height of complaining about all the RNG in Hearthstone, and they were like, "This is why we think RNG is important to Hearthstone." And basically, what
the RNG in Hearthstone.
Yeah, basically what they said is like, we think there's a lot of skill in reacting to novel situations, and and to your point, like if you don't have that, then it becomes rote memorization, which is like not fun for the bulk of the population, and not what
Yeah,
people are looking
that's going to
to
really
do.
limit who wants to play the game if you have that homework.
And arguably StarCraft has a lot of that too, because it's like even though there's a lot of variance in StarCraft, there's a lot of known quantities about maps and matchups and everything that you really have to memorize. Like what does Zerg do with Protoss on this specific map, and how is each expansion point important in this matchup, and so on. So yeah, I think that's actually a really important role of RNG in games as well, is making them sort of making people think on their feet and explore novel situations, and then not have to memorize from a book.
And the thing is, there are a class of players that want to do that memorization. They're often called speedrunners. And
Freaks.
when you have, freaks, when you have that mentality, you have almost it's like a complete, what do you call it, conflict with randomness, right? If you have the mentality that you want to go through and be perfect and practice specifically your execution as well as your strategy, you don't want randoms to come to that at all, which is why randomness is such a killer when you're trying to determine whether a game is a good speed game or not, right?
This is such a good example for what I was talking about earlier, because speedrunners are, to your point, like the classic example of like the player base that complains about randomness to infinity. And I totally get it. Like the worst is when you're doing like 3 hours of gameplay and then suddenly a random rule ruins your run. But at the same time, that's some of the most exciting moments when you're watching speed runs.
It's
like
exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Is waiting to see like, do they get the perfect like RNG to like get that single cycle on the boss? And so yeah.
I like a little. I mean, I do a little speed running myself. I haven't a little bit. I need to, but I like a little variance in the game because not only does it give me a chance to maybe overtake someone who's just technically better, it just adds that excitement, like you said, and it makes your the video of your run more exciting to watch.
That's a really good point too. I mean, we talked about this in the context of the PvP games, but even in speedrunning, it allows you to maybe compete with someone who you aren't quite as good as, because if it's just technical skill, you're going to get the same or similar results every single time. But like, especially in a shorter game, but with randomness, it's like you can just get that really, really lucky run.
Yeah, exactly.
I could only think of one example of a popular, or at least popular enough category of game where there's no variance in experience and there's no randomness, and that was rhythm games. I couldn't come up with any other type of game where there's like a significant player base. Speedrunners don't count. There's significant player base where like people will just go and pay money and play the game over and over without any change of the experience at all. So
I mean, there's difficulty levels, but it's you're kind of opting into the different. It's not quite the same thing, yeah.
Right.
My brain goes to like the Masocore games, I've heard them called in the past, the games that are just like so difficult that you just bang your head against the wall.
Okay.
Like I guess Devil Daggers, or what's the one, the Getting Over It, the one where you're sitting in the pot and you have a giant hammer and you're trying to get up the mountain. But yeah, I mean, even those games, like they don't have a lasting player base. They sort of last for like 3 months. Right, exactly.
Yeah, there's this kind. Are those examples of like too much randomness? Then, like it's so wacky. It's fun to watch for a while, but eventually, it's just not consistent enough to want to play.
So interesting that I was putting it forth as an example of no randomness, but to your point. But to your point, like if you are not amazing at the game, it feels like randomness. Like you don't know what's going to happen when you swing the hammer up. I don't know what's going to happen, but the speedrunners do. So like they've gotten to the point where they can do the same actions over and over again, even with the precise mouse movements, to like get the behavior that they want over and over again. So to them, there's no RNG. But yeah, it's a tricky thing. Sometimes it's a matter of perspective too.
Mm-hmm. There was there's a whole category of platformers that were popular maybe like 10 years ago. The I Want to Be the Guy plus Super Meat Boy plus
Boshi or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, let's explore. Kaizo for sure. Let's explore what happens if you draw a lot more cards. So I think if you were to significantly increase the amount of cards you draw in Magic, you would reduce variance under the current paradigm. And I think this is important to think about because effects that reduce variance have historically been universally like among the most powerful effects in these sort of Magic-ish card games. So obviously in Magic, card draw, scry effects, but also tutors are historically very important when they're good. In fact, they're, the tutors that came out in Alpha were extremely strong, right? And in modern Magic, they've been nerfed down quite a lot. On a lesser level, like life tap, at least when I play Hearthstone, like life tap, the Warlock Hero power that just let you draw extra cards, was considered very powerful because not only did it give you extra resources, but it smoothed out your early turns always so that there was greater consistency in your play. I don't know how that was necessarily accurate in the actual data, but that was the idea. So I think if you were to draw a bunch of extra cards, the end effect would be that you see a lot more of your deck, and that puts a lot more pressure on deck building. That sort of pushes the game in the direction of something more like chess, where you're seeing much more of your deck, so you're reacting less to what you have. It puts more pressure on a competitive player to try to construct the perfect deck and map out all the scenarios.
It becomes more complex while you're playing then, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's like 3 downsides I could see right off the bat. Like, one is that it makes, I think, Andrew, you've talked a lot about this, but like that moment of the draw step is like a key component for like especially new players to have a high moment or a low moment, and that's why it's so nice or elegant in Magic that you have lands which are clearly bad, great to draw early and bad to draw late generally, and spells which are the opposite. So if you're drawing 3 cards, it's like you really hard to tell, was that a good draw? Was that a bad draw? Was that better than average? I don't know. Everything just kind of feels samey, I think, at that point. It also makes figuring out the optimal play a lot more difficult, especially if you're new to the game. Suddenly you have 3 new pieces of information that you have to evaluate on top of everything that's going on already. So the game's going to slow down, and people are going to really struggle to play well. You are increasing the skill ceiling because people have more options, but at a cost, I think. And obviously, like to the earlier points, your deck is going to play out more similarly every game. So you're generally going to get to execute your plan, which is going to feel good for the first 5 or 10 times, and then you're just going to get bored. You're not going to know why necessarily, but you're probably going to be like, I'm going to go do something else because I'm not really getting a lot of variance here, or like variance in experience.
I'm going to go play Darkspore.
That's right. Yeah, good man.
That really reminds me of what this idea reminds me of is like roguelike deck building games where you are kind of getting a whole new hand every turn, but to your point, it's much less interactive of a game, right? It's much less calculating. Your deck is no longer the function of your deck is very different than a Magic deck where your whole deck is sort of an engine where all the cards are very straightforward and easy to play. That takes a lot of load off of, if you were to imagine the same thing in Magic where you get 7 cards, the Magic cards are very complicated and they have a lot of ramifications when you play them, whereas in that roguelike single player game, deck building game, your cards are almost always like very, very straightforward, right? You're making
talking about like
trade-offs.
Like Slay the Spire. Okay.
Yeah, and the whole thing that makes that formula work is that your deck is constantly evolving. So even though your deck would play out the same way if it never changed in every single combat, it doesn't matter because it's constantly changing. So you're constantly going to see your new cards, and you're just like sculpting this baby or whatever like throughout this experience, and you get to see it like grow up in your image and like get to really feel like you created it, and you just get immediate feedback on how you're doing.
It is basically like leveling in an RPG or like an MMO, right? Where your deck is basically your character and you're just getting you're getting new spells along the way that are slightly changing how you play, but you're feeling like there's a bonus in feeling that you're getting some kind of mastery over executing your plan and not necessarily reacting perfectly to your opponent's plan.
This reminds me of something I wanted to say when you were talking to Andrew about fighting games. Slight tangent, but bear with me. Way back in the day in college, I really wanted to make a fighting game MMO where you would start out low level and you would level up, and each time you leveled up, you would get to change your loadout of abilities. And basically, the idea was like it would cost more points to put a complicated ability on an easier button. So let's say you learn Fireball, and it's like at the beginning, Fireball is the quarter circle motion with punch. So it's like kind of hard to do for especially a new player under stress or whatever. But then as you level up, it's like, oh, you can now move Fireball to just like a button press if you want.
Interesting.
And it's like your character would sort of like get better at like doing, and then you could get even more complicated moves, which now the Fireball motion would do, but eventually could graduate to an easier thing as well.
So like it evolves to be easier to play.
In substance,
that sounds interesting, but because of exactly what Swimfan just said, that sounds like exactly the opposite of what you need to do for the game to retain players, right? Whereas like you really need to have the easy things be for the newer players, not the other way around.
You should listen to our fighting game episode, Paul.
Yeah, I have not.
We solved all the problems.
Well, I can. Yeah, we solved it.
It would definitely be a lot more focused on PvE than PvP, although that would be a thing too. But
Do
yeah,
you know about
that's
DFO?
interesting for. I mean, fighting games
Right.
is the obvious application there because of the complexity of controls. But that sounds like that makes me think of it. It's interesting to make game rewards almost part of the meta controls, or like unlocking features of the game essentially, or controller buttons. Yeah, it's interesting.
It certainly breaks down today because, in some sense, because so many players are so good at fighting games. So for them, it'd be like, it doesn't matter what controls this is on, I could do it anyway. I
Yeah.
think back in the day, nobody was that good, so it made more sense. But yeah, it just reminded me of that. It was an old idea that I had.
I had a similar idea. Well, I guess not sure if it's exactly similar, but I wanted to make a Harry Potter game when I was in like middle school, where you cast spells by drawing a shape on the screen with your hand, and the more complicated, and there was like a skill test in like how fast you could draw the shape and how accurately. And the more difficult spells have more difficult shapes. So you have, for a normal player, it would take you a long time to draw them, and so you would not be able to use them as frequently. It's like basically a soft enforced cooldown.
Yeah, I've played a game like that. It wasn't Harry Potter, I don't believe. It was a phone game. I almost want to say it had like geolocation stuff like Pokemon Go, but I'm probably conflating two different
Was
games.
it a
But
Harry
anyway,
Potter Pokemon Go game?
yeah,
No,
I don't
probably
think I
not.
played that.
I don't
But
think
it was, yeah, it was a wizard dueling game where you're literally drawing shapes to like, oh, ice wall, or like, here's a fireball. It was pretty fun for a little while. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is sort of, this is one thing I've been thinking about a lot, which is, yeah, most phone games are sort of fun for a little while, and I wonder if that's just the way it has to be. But that's a whole nother, it's an
Right.
episode idea.
Are there
Really
ever
can't
longer games on mobile?
Can that even work? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm
Unless
not
it-
saying that games should lean that way. Like, I don't know what the economics of it are, but
I mean, it's just like at some point you're like, why put this on mobile? So
yeah, exactly.
because you get long games using other mobile features like walking around, like Pokemon Go, right? Like you play that a long time, but if it weren't for walking around your neighborhood, you'd want that on the TV, I would think.
As it gets easier and easier to port games to mobile, or like as it becomes more of like a side effect of building it in Unreal or whatever, and like it's more
Yeah.
understood how to build for different things, you might see more of that where it's like publishers push to mobile just because they can, and like they'll make some money, and then we'll see if the market reacts positively to that. Arguably, there's already some games like that, especially in the PvP space, like big shooters.
Yeah,
I wonder what the big iPad games are, like stuff that's for the medium tablet sort of screen.
in Japan, a lot of rhythm games are like optimized for the tablet.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I guess I played Final Fantasy Theatrhythm on an iPad.
Yeah, I feel like iPads aren't as popular these days, at least. Well, it's like weird because phones are getting bigger and moving into that space, and laptops are getting smaller and moving into that space. So I feel like they're getting squeezed out a little bit. But in any case, like it's all going to blend together eventually. Maybe the laptops just are the tablets at some point.
Yep.
Yeah, I do
reminds
think
me
that
of Wii games too. Anyway,
I do think I forget if it was Vagar or Andrew or just us that said this, but when I think one big difference is that the phone is not a good medium to play something for 3 hours on.
Yeah.
It's just like compared to basically any other gaming device, no matter what kind, it's just not optimized for that, for like a 3-hour gaming experience. And so, with a few exceptions, like maybe like Candy Crush or whatever, that kind of game, you can play pretty comfortably. But in general, I think when people look for long form experiences, that the form factor or the ergonomics of it kind of get in the way of playing for 3 hours.
Yeah, I think the Switch has kind of tried to attack that space pretty successfully too.
Nintendo historically, actually, most of the consoles I've ever owned are the handhelds, and those are the ones that I play a lot. In fact, the Steam Deck is the console probably the thing I play most of my time on these days. So.
Wow. Do you play the handheld? Play it handheld?
Yeah, I like
Sims 4?
playing games in bed. It's very hard to achieve this actually without a handheld device. So that's
yeah.
really what the Steam Deck comes in.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the restricting variance option?
So what if we draw a lot fewer cards? So what at a high level, this means that the game state doesn't change as much between your first turn and your 10th turn, right? So in a classical game of Magic, you have 3 times as many resources information on the 10th turn or the 6th turn or whatever as you did on the first turn, right? And so by restricting the amount of card draw, you may not even necessarily restrict the amount of variance or randomness, even though you're ostensibly taking away the mechanic that creates the randomness. But you are restricting the information. And to me, when I thought about this reminded me of something like TFT or like Pokemon team building, where you have a game where you're sort of going in with like a set strategy with all the resources that you already have. And I think that sort of pulled in the same direction as more cards, which is it puts more pressure on like study and planning and pre-gaming is what's coming to mind. That's not the right word, but
it's
rather
more like
than reacting.
More like war games where it's like I start with an army and then like maybe I get to reinforce occasionally, but mostly it's like my army or Warhammer, for example. The other place my mind goes with this is like you could achieve the stated goal not by reducing the number of cards drawn, but by giving the player more control over what types of cards they're drawing.
Right.
So something I've seen in Magic, players try to occasionally fix mana screw by having 2 decks. One has all your spells and one has all your lands, and you choose which one to draw from. And I think it's fun for a little while. You're like, I have whatever I want whenever I want it, but pretty quickly it's like you just feel like you're missing something because it's like you lose those highs and lows because you're always getting what you want.
Yeah.
It's like heaven being boring, you know.
I would say that is very similar though to the Hearthstone lore paradigm, right? Of the mana being not take the cards, and I do think that there are ways to design the system such that that is replayable. But yeah, I do think that there is something I want to bring up later on that front, which is so Commander is a Magic format where you're building, like you have much stronger deck building restrictions. So in this case, you have a Highlander or a singleton restriction where you have 100 cards instead of 60, and you can only have one copy of each card in your deck. So basically, you're seeing a much greater variety of cards in your deck. But one of the costs of that, I think, was the idea of you're no longer able to get like specific engine cards that you rely on, right? Where it's like, oh well, to function, my deck is built around this specific card, and in a normal Magic deck, I could make tutors to find it, I could make card draw to find it. I have 4 copies of it in a 60 card deck, so I'm pretty likely to get it. That can no longer happen in that kind of deck building paradigm. And I think the way Commander gets around that is that it makes your whole deck built around an engine card, which is your commander, and that is sort of identity. And that's a very extreme way of doing what you kind of just described, where you're separating out you have your quote unquote like filler cards, and you have your one engine card in this case. And I do think that you could enforce those kind of restrictions by separating out your deck into the 2 sets, perhaps by having more than, instead of just commander, you have like some kind of artifact card or magic card that's in a separate pile than the rest of your filler.
Yeah, you mentioned Hearthstone and lore. I think it's a great point that like the Hearthstone mana system is in a lot of ways this, and I think it underscores why they decided to add so much RNG to the cards themselves. And I think that was actually a really smart decision, especially having worked on lore now. Probably in hindsight, I kind of wish I'd pushed for more RNG to be in lore, but it was a really tough battle to fight because our lore had almost kind of promised that it was going to be a low RNG experience by this point. And so,
oh really?
Yeah, so it's kind of a rock and a hard place where it's like we had already kind of attracted these people. We were trying to competitively differentiate, so it made sense, I think, at the time in a way. But it turned out that, like, maybe the audience that wanted, this low RNG experience wasn't as big as Riot had hoped.
And the Hearthstone mana experience, just in case people don't know, is you just get a mana each turn, and you don't have to draw for it. You're still drawing for spells.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, it's similar to the kind of toy example we discussed, except you get to draw a land and a spell every turn. You just draw one from each. So it is very deterministic in that sense. And then to combat that, Hearthstone created a ton of cards that basically are quite strong, and then also create a random card from a wide swath of the game's history. And so every game of Hearthstone plays out very differently, but not because of the cards you directly put in your deck, because of cards. It's instead because of cards that were generated by RNG, which has its pros and cons. It does make it harder to play around what your opponent might have, which will get your pro players complaining and your esports fans complaining. But I think Hearthstone has shown that it can be a worthy trade-off because you get a larger audience in return.
I have a couple of thoughts on this actually. Well, first of all, I feel validated because I tried lore after Yip suggested that I do so, and it lasted about 4 hours, and I wrote like a 14-page negative review, which we'll share with him directly. I can share it with you if you're interested.
Sure,
about a lot of the similar things that you just stated. The one thing about Hearthstone was that at the top level, and I wanted to mention this earlier, so it's not directly related, but at the top level, it really does feel in Hearthstone like you're playing your whole deck and not your hand. In many matchups, even aggro matchups or mid-range matchups, you really do feel like you have to know all the cards that you have and all the cards your opponent have, because I think it's partially a deck size concern, but it's also like a resource constraint where because you hit 10 mana all the time, you'll always get to the end game unless you die. So it's more of you will always be able to play all the spells in your deck unless you die. So that it does often feel like you're playing for fatigue in a lot of matchups where you're getting to the end, getting all the resources out and trying to trade as favorably as possible so that whoever has the few resources at the end wins. That may have changed. That seems like something that maybe...
I was going to say, I remember the Freeze Mage player, so I think you probably hit that point more than most people. But to your point, depending on the meta, that can be a really big thing. Where
that may have changed at some point.
I think they pushed away from it somewhat, but it's still Control Warrior. If it's good, causes it anyway.
Yeah. And the final thing that I no longer remember. Actually, no, I totally forgot. Never mind. Moving on. We got 2 out of 3. What were we talking about?
We're talking about drawing fewer cards.
Yeah, either drawing fewer cards or drawing more specific types of cards.
Right. I think we basically covered it, which is that somehow it is really interesting to me as I'm thinking about this, that both cases pull towards sort of what I would argue to be less fun for the individual game. Right?
The extremes aren't fun.
There's this phenomenon I've noticed in gaming where it happens quite frequently that the first game that is designed in a new genre ends up being the best one, and it blows my mind because it's like, how are these designers knocking it out of the park so much so that really smart people can think about the genre for 10 more years or 20 more years and still not be able to really improve on a lot of the core aspects of that initial design. And I think Magic is a great example of that, where it's if you really sit down and you have a really good understanding of design and player psychology and everything, and you think about how to change Magic to be better, it's actually surprisingly difficult.
Pretty hard.
Yeah, there are things.
If you think about
what's the Magic killer in the past 4 decades?
Well, it has been Hearthstone. Well, Magic has also killed itself, but that's sort of its own. That's sort of a separate topic. But
can you give a couple examples of that, Paul? That's really interesting.
Yeah, the other one that comes to mind immediately is Dominion. So Dominion invented the deck building genre, and I guess Slay the Spire is another one where it essentially invented the deck building roguelite genre, and Monster Train had some cool twists on it. You can definitely add mechanics and add complexity and make for a different experience that's better to some people, but it's very hard when these amazing games come out and show the way. It ends up being very hard to come up with a game that's just strict, not strictly, but better to the large majority of the audience. Because
one example I have is RimWorld. RimWorld, if you're familiar, launched the whole genre, but of basically copycat spin-offs. But I think it has stood the test of time. I think one effect here is that the first game that comes out also has to be the one that has. The first game that comes out in our minds is the one that has the most initial success, and that points to it being well designed. So, for example, I think the original Dota Auto Chess was maybe not the best formula of the Auto Battler game, right? It was popular enough, and of course there were problems with the platform it was on, but it was good enough to get a bunch of attention. But I think, in addition to being completely destroyed by Valve, I think it had problems that later implementations fixed.
Well, and
point, yeah.
of course, League of Legends invented the MOBA genre, and there were many copycats that came after.
MOBA is another good one. The MOBA formula was iterated on for like 10 years before what you would even recognize as Dota All Stars existed, and that
Oh,
that's
really?
sort of yeah, it
So-
started as a StarCraft mod actually.
That's right. Yeah.
But there, in StarCraft, in Brood War, there was like 15 popular custom games that all had the same formula, where you're like run to a lane and kill a bunch of stuff and run back to base and upgrade
Yeah.
and then run back to lane.
Was
and
it
I think
a StarCraft mod before a Warcraft mod? I can't remember
yeah,
the exact history.
it was
Yeah.
called AI. I think the original mod that they pulled from was called Aeon of Strife, AOS.
That's it, yeah, sounds right.
But that was just one of like 15. That was just like I assume that was just one that they named because they played a lot of it. But there was like 15 games like that. I remember what I was going to say. I think a lot of times when the player base complains about randomness, they don't actually want, or like they won't have more fun if there's less randomness. They won't play more if there's less randomness. I think they're actually just complaining because they want to post on Reddit about something or just to complain about something.
Well, you get
or
highs
to
and
blame
lows,
something
right?
else.
You get your lows out there too, of like, oh, this fucker, I could have beaten him, but I
Yeah, but I think it's just one of those things that's sort of like yerked its way into the public consciousness, where like people just feel like, oh, well, RNG in games is bad because it's stupid. Like, why would you want a competitive RNG? Obviously, and then when something bad happens, they sort of lean onto that without considering the consequences.
There are two things that come to mind with that. One is like it's a common saying amongst game designers that like players are really, really good at telling you when something's wrong, but not that great at telling you how to fix it.
This
Yeah.
is a Morrow thing.
Yeah.
This is a big Morrow.
Yeah, and so that's a really good example of like, and then I think it ties into another reason. Andrea talked a lot about this, but another reason I think RNG is super important to modern games is ego shielding. I think like humans have really fragile egos, and they really want to feel smart, especially in
Not
their
me.
downtime. And so anything that you can use that you could reach out to sort of shield your ego when you lose, to blame it on, gets just heaped a lot of blame and like becomes a really big thing to the player base. And so RNG takes that fall a lot. Some Elo Hell is a thing in League of Legends that people blame all the time. The matchmaker, the shuffler in Magic, people still complain that it's broken 20 years later,
Yep.
and so on and so on. So yeah, it's just that sort of lightning rod of complaints. But I think regardless of that, it's almost pointing at how effective it is at getting people to like be able to still feel smart while walking away from a loss.
We're good at externalizing our mistakes or our
For
losses.
Yeah, it's something I was thinking about recently. Is like video games tend to have really short, relatively short, like game times versus like something like basketball or sort of like traditional sports. And so because you're playing so many games in a session,
Physical.
sports, I like it. It's much more likely that just through the random walk that you're doing on your 50-50 coin flips, that you will have a losing streak that's pretty significant in a given session. And so again, it's like those are the moments when players just flip out and they're like, something's
Yeah.
wrong. That's not me, because it can't be
Because
me.
it can't be me.
That's right. And like if there's
Why do I
RNG,
keep dating all these crazy people?
it's true.
Yeah, why do you
if
do
it's
that, man?
if it's not RNG, then it's got to
They're
be something else.
nuts.
And like players are actually really inventive at coming up with, even in games without any RNG, they'll find things to blame. But it makes it easier when there's like a convenient scapegoat. So
Yeah, and it is a hard concept, because where else does that concept even come up in life? I mean, games, I guess.
You mean specifically with randomness, or with
where randomness
simulation
is
itself?
considered or could be considered a positive aspect of it. You know what I mean?
People, have you ever spoken to humans before? Like, okay, so
No.
I think a common
Elaborate.
No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding. I think a common one is people blaming their situation on, like, their situation in life on things that were out of their control, basically. Like, the people I'm around, or like, I was poor while growing up, so I didn't have the opportunities, or like I just didn't get into this specific class with a good professor, and now I'm feeling this way. And on some level, like, those are things that are legitimate complaints, but I think the blame, and especially ascribing the outcome to the input, essentially is where people externalize a
We
lot
do
of
do
it.
a lot of that. Although I think some of those examples you gave are not luck in the same type. They're
I think they're
Yeah,
luck
chance.
or not randomness, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's the
Yeah.
kind of luck
yeah,
that
okay.
people don't call luck. Another example that comes to mind, it's not perfect, but like I think of like blackjack tables or casinos, and like it's very common for people to complain that they lost because the person ahead of them played improperly or like didn't follow the rule book is when it comes to hitting or standing. And it's like, yes, you got a different card than this one situation, but like in the grand scheme, like you're just pulling from a random deck.
It's still just as random. I mean, I could have
Exactly.
pulled the card that you didn't want. It doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah, there
I
could
was
have been
just
the
about
card
to
you
bring
wanted.
up that example because I always I find it a very interesting thing about gamblers. Like I'm very interested in hearing gambling stories and stuff because they have so much magic in
Yeah.
the stories.
Yeah, you have to ascribe. I guess you want to make your mind wants to make sense of the madness or
Yeah,
just the chaos.
you're a believer of something. It's like the gambler. It's gambler.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. I
Yeah,
have a. Oh,
I
we
well, I
move
was gonna
on.
say I have I don't know if we're going to more RNG examples. I have a list of like other things I like about RNG, which I will get to when we're done with talking about RNG. I'd like to make
Sure.
sure we caught all of them, or I
Okay.
can do it now if we
Yeah,
are out of. I didn't know if you had another.
let's throw one out there. Let's go one at a time and see where it takes us.
Sure. So yeah,
What else you got?
this is one that as like a systems designer I think a lot about, and systems designers are responsible for designing everything outside of the core gameplay and like how players progress and how they get access to their abilities and their options and unlock characters and so on. So like it's a really interesting question. How much RNG do you put into the process of unlocking tools within the game? And one of the things I really like about adding RNG is that like for example booster packs in Magic, but that's not the best example because it's has a lot of other considerations tied to money, for example.
Said the money,
Is that the more RNG you put into that process, the more you force build variety onto the population because players just don't have every tool at their disposal. So when you play against other players through matchmaking, you're going to get a much more varied experience because even if Control Warrior is the best deck in the metagame, not everyone can play Control Warrior because not everyone has all the cards for it. And so that is
Okay.
something we tried to do in lore because we didn't give everybody. That said, it has a big downside, which I assume you may be bringing up, when you tie it into a ranked system, because obviously it
Yes.
feels really bad to lose because you don't have access to the best cards. And so it needs to be used. It's best used in like a PvE situation, I think, like Darkspore, where if anything, you're playing cooperatively with your friends and not
Yep.
fighting each other. But especially for those PvE, it's even better for co-op because it's like you're more guaranteed that your friend will be doing something different than you are, and then that's even more fun.
Cool. Yeah.
Now you guys have a strategy together that you have to come up with on the fly instead of just you both play the deck that everyone agrees is the best deck online and very samey.
I'm just getting beaten by all these whales.
Yeah.
On a
Exactly.
similar, like the non-card game roguelikes do this as well, right? Where in many of these games, one that comes to mind is what was that? It was this Mega Man game. Anyway, these games
A
often
roguelike Mega Man game?
Mega Man Battle Network inspired game.
Oh, okay.
What is it called? I can't remember suddenly. One Step to Eden, something like that.
Oh,
One
yeah.
Step to Eden.
One step towards
Anyway, in these games, you're playing like more of a traditional RPG style, like combat game, but your build is restricted similarly by the roguelike, build up system, and so that's sort of a very similar with two experiences. So we've talked about this specific mechanic with every guest, and also on like half our episodes, which tells you that this is a flashpoint mechanic in the world, I'm sure, which is the World of Warcraft Legion legendary system. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah. I played
So this,
them. Yeah.
yeah. So did everyone apparently. But this system was very cool, and I think people were overall very favorable of that expansion. But it also, because of the competitive nature, it introduced specifically that problem that you introduced, right? Which is that when you put the system in end game in a competitive environment, it becomes really shitty if you don't get the good outcome, right? Where you are uncompetitive or you're benched from your raid because of something that was completely out of your control, other than because you don't have 16 hours a day to put into the game, right? That prevents you from doing so.
And then you get
so-
jealous of your friends.
Yeah,
Yeah, even
yeah.
even
Covet thy
before
neighbor's
legendaries.
loot.
were introduced, that was the first time I quit World of Warcraft. Was I was a hunter and I really needed this crossbow that dropped off this dog thing, and I was in every single raid and it just never dropped.
Yeah.
It was like everybody else had their loot, I didn't have it, and then finally there was 1 week that I got benched for some random reason. I think I showed up 5 minutes late or whatever, and I was like, put me in, and they were like, nah, they're already in. And then of course it drops that week, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I was just done. It's like now I'm going to be the worst hunter from then on because they don't have the thing and so on. Yeah,
They didn't save it for you.
No,
you can't. You can't.
At the time you couldn't. Yeah, you could only give it to someone who was there.
I still think.
In fact, yeah, you still can't. Yeah, you always have to give it to someone who was present when the boss was killed, I think.
Interesting.
I think this really points to a phenomenon with this mechanic where in those situations, the positive outcome becomes way less good and the negative outcome becomes way worse, right? So like, in normal variants, you're hopefully balancing the positive and the negative. So like, yes, sometimes you get a really negative outcome, but when you get a positive outcome, it feels really good. But I think in those kind of end game competitive examples, everyone walks in with the expectation that they're going to be maxed, right? That's sort of the baseline expectation, and then beyond that is your skill. And so when you put this kind of high variance system there, when people get the drop, they're not necessarily super excited compared to at an earlier point in the game or in a different type of game, because their expectation is already that, well, okay, finally I got it. It took me so long, but like I'm finally able to even play to start the game. It's not like, oh my God, I got this thing that I'm super excited about. The negative goes way down, right, compared to the baseline as well.
Yeah, I think it's generally a side effect of like situations that are highly competitive in some way, like you said, like with DPS charts or whatever. And then on top of that, where the known best build exists, because at that point, every bit of randomness in between you and that feels like more like a grind and just like an obstacle than it does a joyous experience. I think this is also a really great example because it introduced the concept of pity timers, which is like another interesting thing to talk about. And that was basically this idea. I don't remember if they had it in at the beginning. I think they might have added it relatively quickly, but not right away. But basically, the idea here is like there's this like timer counting up that like every time you kill the boss, if you do, it rolls on the loot table, and if you don't get a legendary, then it ticks this counter, and when the counter gets to a certain thing, 10 or whatever, and you haven't gotten a legendary, then you're guaranteed to get one on your next kill. And there's a couple, I totally get why they did it, and in some sense it made sense, but there's a couple downsides. One is that, to your point, like it definitely undermines the joy of getting lucky when you know that it was just a pity handout, and you just like, and it makes it feel even worse when you know it took the maximum amount of time to get it, because everybody of course knows the timer and is counting it on their own. And so like, and even if you did get the loot that you wanted, your primary emotion is relief rather than joy. And like, if you didn't get it, then you feel even worse because you know your pity timer is now at 0 and you don't have it, so you're even further from getting it.
Right,
and
you get a legendary, but it's not necessarily the one you want.
Yep.
And I was going back through my notes because I was interviewed about luck way back when, and I was reading what I had written, and apparently a World of Warcraft designer was interviewed about this, and he mentioned that he kind of in hindsight wished that they had put good luck protection on it. Like normally you would call it a different word for bad luck. Sorry, for pity timer is bad luck protection. And so he actually had wished that they had done good luck protection, because he was worried about this case where people would get 3 legendaries in a row, 3 kills, and like people would be super jealous and call it a bug, and they'd be mad that they didn't have it. And so he's like, well, it's a constant thing as a designer. You have this random swath in front of you, and like, a designer needs to think about where do you want to carve off possibilities to make for a better experience in the end. And I think it's actually good that they didn't do that, because if you think about it carefully, imagine a situation. So like that would basically prevent you, if you get a legendary, you would be prevented from getting another legendary for like 3 kills or something. Imagine how bad that would feel if you got the legendary you didn't want, and now you have to kill
like
you don't even have a chance to get it. Yeah. Exactly. So it's really good that they do that. Good.
I think the difficulty of this specific system, and the interesting thing about this system, is that I think it's very clear to players, or maybe not to players, but to designers, that this is a fundamentally really cool system that feels like it can work. But the reason we keep talking about it, and everyone keeps talking about it, people have different solutions to it, but there is not a clear solution to it, highlights how difficult it is to put this kind of system in an end game, right? And there is a reason why I think basically nothing like it has been done since in the highly competitive game, and why it was controversial at the time, even though it made for, I think they got the outcomes they were looking for, just they also got a lot of more negative outcomes that maybe were not worth it.
Yeah, my guess is that they had a similar thought process to what I was saying earlier, where it's like
Yeah.
it would be more interesting if there's more build diversity
Yeah,
in
for
the
sure.
players, and they have to use different talent trees because I happen to get this legendary, so now I need to spec to use it. But that's not how the players think about it. The players are like, I want the best build or nothing, and like if I get the legendary, I'm probably not even going to spec to use it because like fuck that thing, and so I'm just going to spec to do what I'm already doing, and and then hope to
Just
get the
deal.
thing that I want.
I think there were on our episode about this. I think we talked about two ideas. One, which is that it is actually pretty. A lot of legendaries were not designed in a way that you had to spec to do them. A lot of them were just bad flat number buffs, and I wonder why that is. Because I think they could have done more
Yeah.
to try to enforce a different build variety. At the very least, you could have reached a point where it was like, okay, well, there's like 4 viable builds, and
Mhm.
you just unfortunately, if you want to play this one, you can't. But at least you have something that's competitive. Obviously, that's very difficult to design, right? Especially at the end game raider level. But a lot
yeah.
of the legendaries did end up just being filler trash. Like there's essentially,
Yeah.
and that's unfortunate, I think.
It's tricky. There's definitely trade-offs. I mean, my mind goes to, I think you make a great point. Like that if it had been designed such that they were so good that you had to use them, but then
Right.
you needed to spec, they were clearly aimed at a certain talent tree or a talent spec. And so you had to spec that to use it. And then that was a clear DPS upgrade from what you were doing before. Then you would have had more build variety in the raid, and people would still be salty that they didn't have the best one, but they would be a lot less salty, I think, if they're actually using it and like getting a new playstyle too, which is actually a really kind of good thing for keeping players around. Is actually sometimes forcing them to switch builds can actually improve their experience unless they really hate the playstyle for whatever reason.
I just
But
think maybe at the World of Warcraft level, that was essentially multiply, like that's basically adding like 4 more specs to every class, right? And I just think maybe they just felt like it wasn't viable from a design perspective to make sure that all those things are balanced and all the playstyles are viable in some way.
yeah, for sure. I mean, my mind says like maybe you could just design them in also a flat number way, but in a way that only works with a certain talent
That's
spec.
true. Yeah, that's true.
So it doesn't have to be a new rotation or anything. It just makes that rotation that already exists really good and clearly better than the non-legendary rotation for the other specs. But the downside is that you increase the difference between the haves and have-nots. Anybody who doesn't have a legendary is going to be like 50% worse than anybody who does.
Right.
And so at that point, you need a really aggressive pity timer or like everybody gets it on their 5th kill sort of thing or something. So yeah, there's so many trade-offs in systems design, which is why it's really fun and also frustrating at the same time. And some of the trade-offs aren't even apparent when you're working on it. You don't learn about them until after the player base gets a hold of it.
So
Yeah,
I had
until you run tens of thousands of players through it.
yeah. Real quick, I have a related but slightly different example.
Please.
So at Wizards, I was making this strategy game called Uncivilized: The Goblin Game. It was a 32-player asynchronous strategy game, 1 turn per day, and you would split into 8 groups of 4, and you would work with your team or your guild to try and win the sort of like this battle. It's almost like an early battle royale in a strategy sense, I guess, although that didn't exist yet. And so there was a faction called
This was early internet time. This is early online.
This was like 2005, so like internet was like in decent shape at this point. It was going to
But
be
in terms of like multiplayer, it was sort of
uh,
just
yeah. I mean,
don't know.
there were real-time multiplayer experiences by now, but like no one had really solved how to do a really good real-time strategy multiplayer experience, which is a hard problem in terms of like turn-based strategy. So this was an idea. I was really fascinated by the idea of asynchronous games and also of what would you call it? Like idle or not idle games quite, but games that are like always around but are updating on a slower time period, or something like that. It's a little bit like clickers, but not quite the same. And so
I'm also interested in this idea, coincidentally. I'm still interested in this idea.
Yeah, I was fascinated by it back then. I still am. And Dungeons and Dragons Tiny Adventures was a different game that I made at Wizards, which was actually really popular and really engaging. And it was all about this idea that you're sending your adventurers off on these quests, and you get a postcard once an hour telling you about what has happened on their quest. And then
I tried to make this game in the Discord bot at one point.
No way. Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
When was this?
This was who are you asking, actually?
I'm asking Regal.
Yeah.
Oh, you're asking me. I never got very far in it, but this was when I was about to go back to school and I was trying to find something to actually code again because I accepted my fate in the death of my life. But this is something I was very interested in. It was inspired by the mission tables in Draenor, actually, Warlords of Draenor. But it was basically exactly what you're describing, where I thought it was a good fit for a Discord, like a social game, because the interface could be simple enough to do with Discord commands, and there was a social aspect where you could have server-wide things, and you could make the commands in the channels with your friends, and have like a conversation, have activity in your Discord server based on what you are doing, and people could chime in and ask you to do certain things or tell you about things or whatever.
It is weird. It is weird to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is weird to me that there aren't more popular asynchronous things where I take a turn on my lunch break every day. Words with
arguably,
friends, shit.
Super Auto Pets and Backpack Battles are doing that with like
Super
in the
Auto
$100
Pets,
space. There's
And
definitely games that do it, but not huge ones.
I would actually say gacha games are basically what you described. That is how they're basically enforced for you to play. Really traditional, like energy-based mobile game.
Yeah.
I
can play once a day and only once a day.
Yeah, they actively prevent you from having a 2-hour session, whereas something like Super Auto Pets doesn't. The real life example that's very similar to what you described is fantasy football, and that is something that that kind of paradigm is something that I'm very interested in seeing if can be explored, just because that is something that's very easy to get into and clearly is fun, or like can have some legs, but yeah, and doesn't exist.
So what do you mean? What about? Because I don't do fantasy football. Like, what do you? What?
So in fantasy football,
you're
you're playing quote unquote once a week, right? But throughout the week, you're immersed in this ecosystem. Your fantasy, yes. During the week, your fantasy, on Sunday, your football.
End game fantasy.
No, during the week, you're immersed in this ecosystem that can sell you ads. Basically, you're reading news, you're clicking websites, you're reading all kinds of updates from writers. So there's this whole ecosystem supported by writers, and they sell you ads, and they have jobs and whatever. And but you're only playing once a week, and what you're playing is like the decisions you're making up to the week based on like what advantages you think you know. It's like, oh well, I know that this team's defense is bad, so I'm going to start this lower tier receiver against them or whatever.
Yeah. It also has a striking similarity to play-by-mail games, which is something we had talking about. So I want to loop back to that because I do want to talk about them.
Let's talk about it now.
Yeah, I mean this relates directly, right? I mean it's the original asynchronous.
Let me finish the Uncivilized example quickly. So basically, there were those 8 guilds. The draw was that because it was a slow game, you could be pretty complicated, and people would still have time to figure it out. And so each guild had a unique victory condition, completely unique, and they played totally differently from one another. And so the guild I want to talk about is Dragon Tamers. So their goal was to steal a dragon egg and to bring it back home and to nurse it, like to take care of it. And then the baby dragon would hatch, and they would have to nurse it up to adulthood. And like it would have all these needs, and it would be capricious, and kind of like it would want a lot of food, but sometimes it needs to be warm, and so on and so forth. And then if you could do that before anybody else finished their goal, your dragon would sort of help you take over the world. And so I was designing how this would work, and I was like, oh, sometimes guilds are doing really well and they've just got everything in hand and like they're crushing it and they've got all the resources they need, and also it's a baby and like it's hard to take care of babies, so like there should just be like a small chance that like even if you do everything, even if you give it all the resources it needs, the baby just gets pissed and like you don't get a good result that turn. And so I coded this in, and like wow, I could not have anticipated how negative the response would be from players. It's obvious in hindsight, and I like coined it in my head. I called it the negative lottery effect. It's basically like if you have a really small chance of something terrible happening, then, and especially when you did everything else right, that like there was nothing you could have done to prevent it, it just feels fucking awful when it happens.
That's bad variance.
Yes. And so that is an example of how to not use RNG in your game. And so I removed that. And like, yes, sometimes the Dragon Tamers are running away with it, but it's a strategy game. And if they're doing so well that they have all the resources they need and it's a competitive strategy game, then like they're doing well and they should be rewarded for that. So the game was much, much better for it. Not having.
It reminds me of Oregon Trail, just getting hit by.
Yes.
You're dead now.
Yeah, that's true.
There was a very similar example I want to bring up, which is one of the things I hate most in sort of like roguelike games is when you get presented 3 choices that you can't make any, like you can only make inferences about based on what the text says to you. You can't make any in-game inferences about. It's like, oh, you get to a dark cave. Do you go to the left path where there's moss growing, the middle path where there's water, or the right path where there's a ray of
time
light?
stories all over.
That's
And,
totally it's definitely a player type thing. Some people hate that more than others,
Yeah.
but I get it. I totally get it.
Keep in mind that Regal doesn't like when writers make him feel emotions and things. So he's a systems guy, not a magical cave guy.
I don't like role play. Let's
yeah.
I guess we can summarize it that way. But
Well,
yeah,
I mean that's just like a variance fork, though, right? Like it's not as long as it's not the whole way through.
It is, but I think to Paul's point, the specific thing I feel is bad is when you just pick one, because I feel like at that point I'm just picking one arbitrarily. I'm just like basically flipping.
If you pick one and it's instant death,
and it's death, that's like, well, like what am I supposed to do? And then I think the outcome for the player, at least for me, is that now what I learned from that is, okay, well, I can't just play this game. I have to open up the wiki and look at all the possible options and figure out which one doesn't lead me to get instantly killed, right? And I think that's a very negative experience that you don't want the player to go through.
Yeah, variance that leads you down 3 different paths that make you want to try a different build is good, but if it's just like choose your own adventure, do you drink the red or blue potion, and the blue potion kills you?
That moment when you finally decide, like, okay, I just need to look at the wiki to have a good time with this game is like such a it's such a sad thing when it happens, even though like you'll probably have more fun in the short term because you now know what's going on, but like it kills
it's like 2 different games almost.
Yeah, exactly. I try to be aware of when I make that decision, and I struggle with like negative outcomes sometimes in games like Detroit Become Human or something like that, where it's like there are these irreversible negative things that can happen where my characters die.
Yeah, it's almost really all about that. That's like the hook of the game is if you die, it keeps going and everyone's sad.
I hold out as long as I can, but it's really hard. And then there's like achievements that I want to, and I'm like, I could miss those, and I'm like, but it's like one of those cases where the player's undermining their own experience, which is too bad.
Yeah, that kind of fucks it up quite a bit. Like in a single player experience, I'm way more tempted in a multiplayer experience to be like, all right, what am I doing wrong? Like
you almost have to
look it up.
In a competitive experience. Yeah, I think for that to work, you really just have to somehow establish the player early that like in the single player experience that like somehow failure is okay. Sometimes you like in the Detroit Become Human example, not that I played the game, but I assume like the whole purpose of that is that failure is not okay, but you have to live with it. But like you have to get the player into the mindset that you want them to be in, where it's like, oh, my companion died, but I'm accepting that they can move on for some reason. And once that's established, I don't know if that. I mean, there are some players that can never get into that, right? But I think like how to establish that early on is.
I mean, we generally just don't accept if it's just a full negative that I got to move on with. I mean, the David Cage Detroit Become Human type games are really exceptions, right? Like when I think of other games like that, I think of like XCOM type, Fire Emblem shit, but most people probably reload, right? They don't continue.
Yeah, Fire Emblem, I think you're almost expected to reload. I think it's designed with reloading in mind. There's also in the modern games, there's been like no permadeath mode for a long time. But yeah, I think
we couldn't accept that Eris was dead.
Reload.
Just reload.
Spoilers for Final Fantasy VII.
So yeah, Play by Mail games also do not have wikis online, or did not at the time, which is another way to wrap back around to them. Which because that was actually
it somewhere.
Yeah, not even. That was the thing. It was like too early even for that, which was fascinating because it became about one of the things I loved about them is like literally people would pass around notebooks, like they would mail it to you in snail mail, and it would be like this is all of the accumulated knowledge of our guild about this game, which is not at all complete. Huge gaping holes, and and they would share it with you if you got in their good graces, and then you would be expected to start contributing to that and like filling in things and sending it to the leader who collates it, and it just became these like fascinating moments where it's like diplomacy takes place through like often actual letters, where my brothers would be opening up like a letter from this other star captain in this game called Beyond the Stellar Empire, who's like literally talking in like role-playing speak about like how he wants to like make a truce and not take their system over here if they don't take that one there. But yeah, so Play by Mail games, real quick, they were games back in the day that were like basically the first chance I experienced to do like multiplayer arguably digital experiences, but like the player's experience has no digital aspect to it at all. The computer on the other end is the arbiter of what is happening, and someone programmed the game into a computer. But my experience is that I send in a physical turn sheet through the mail to the company that's running it. They input my orders and they input everyone else's orders. They hit a button and the world advances one step, and then they mail it back to me, and like a week later I get something in my mailbox. I read my turn. It has all sorts of data about what the world is happening in the world and all sorts of results of my actions and so on, and then but it comes with another turn sheet, and I do that again as long as I want. Everybody's doing that, and the turns cost like $2 a piece, I would say, which was a lot back then, especially to be paying that like every week or two.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, so there's so I didn't understand this. There is a computer component. It's not just you sending turns back and forth for a chess game or whatever. It's
yeah. It's like a multiplayer server, like what would you even call it? Like mainframe almost, although maybe it was.
But you're mailing in your move. Okay.
Totally. So it's like a very slow turn-based game, which inspired a lot of my future work in a lot of ways. Because it's like, yeah, there's a turn maybe every week, but that might have even been too fast for like mail at that point. So it might have been every 2 weeks. I can't remember.
So I'm curious about. I had also not familiar with these. This reminds me of the early browser-based games, which I played when I was just able to like speak, which were like O Game, Imperial Conflict. These. It sounds like an early version of that, but did they play the same? Like, what was the goal of these games? How do you win? How do you do anything?
Yeah, so there was actually a wide variety of them, but I'll start from the first one I was exposed to, which is Beyond the Stellar Empire. This was 100% like very similar to, I think O Game was in space, right?
Yeah,
yes. Very similar to O Game, very similar to EVE Online in the sense that like, there's a huge world of stars and you're trying to take them over. Obviously, the graphics were very different. It's just printouts and star maps that are literally printed onto a page. I never played this one because I was a little too young when I was growing up, and also like it was overwhelming for me. Like this idea of all these, there's a lot of diplomacy too, and that was kind of scary. Like talking to 20 people in their 20s, trying to make deals with them when I was like 7 years old or whatever. So this one, mostly my brothers played it, but if I talk to them now, they quote this one as probably being their favorite one, even though it was maybe because it was their first. So that was that. Then the next one that I was exposed to was called It's a Crime. This one was about being a mafia boss, and so your turns would be things like, I'm going to go commit arson at that storefront. I'm going to go rob this jewelry store, and then you would get results like, oh, the cop showed up and like you lost a guy, but you got a bunch of money. And this one, I also didn't play this one quite as much. I was still a little young. This one was notable because I would always like look forward to the turns coming. I really loved it, even though I wasn't playing it. It was also too expensive for me. I did not have that kind of money at 7 years old or whatever. And so I would rush home after school, grab the turn out of the mailbox, even though it was for my brothers, and then they would get super pissed when they got home that I had already opened it.
Yeah.
But the way in which I paid them for this sort of was I would take all their turns. I loved it so much that I would create a second game for them out of existing turns. So I would give them a turn sheet. They would fill it out and then get to play a separate campaign for free. And I would go and like look through all their old turns, find relevant things, and put it together into a single like result, and then like give them the result. So they got to play like a weird PvE version of it.
But you were somehow too young for the game still? I don't
yeah, well, mostly it was the money thing at that point.
The money thing, yes.
That's a good point.
So the person running that computer program, are they making money, or is that just operating costs?
No, this
is like a company running it.
Yeah, it was a lot of these were run by this company called Reality Simulations Inc., RSI. I remember that to this day. They still actually exist. They still run a game I'll talk about in a bit at conventions. So if you go to Gen Con, they will have a booth and you can pay them $20 and you can literally play the game nonstop. Well, not nonstop, like once an hour throughout the entire convention. So it's an accelerated time schedule where you just drop off your turn sheet instead of mailing it, and you get to play an entire like lifetime I'll explain that one later.
Fun. Retro.
Yeah. Super cool. I used to look forward to that a lot.
There's a lot of anticipation building there, I gather.
And the cool thing is getting to meet people in person too, because they're people who you've interacted with. The game I'm talking about had this like in-game newspaper that you would get every week, and it would talk about like highs and lows of people in the world, and then you get to meet them in the flesh. You're like, oh, you're him, you're that person that I have a rivalry with, and so on. Getting back to It's a Crime quickly.
Were they ever surprised that you were 7 years old? And we're like,
oh. And at this point, by the time I was at the conventions, I was probably like 16 or so.
Still dicey.
Yeah, I wasn't playing the mail game anymore, but I was still loved the idea of playing conventions. It was way cheaper. You paid $20 or even less at that point, $10 or $15. Got to play the whole weekend, which was way cheaper than playing that many turns in real life or in the mail thing. And it was just super fun to get to do it on such an accelerated time. But yeah, real quick, it's a crime. The thing that I remember from that one is that if you got to a point where your mafia family was strong enough, the game would literally pull out. It would zoom out, and you would become a crime father, like the Godfather or something. I'm forgetting the right term, capo or something. And then literally the entire game shifted. So instead of zooming in and looking at individual storefronts and everything, you're now looking at like entire cities, and like other players are now like doing your bidding, because like you can see who has territory everywhere, and you can see what their families are doing, and you can like start meddling with like what's going on in Chicago or what's going on in Boston. And like that,
the game changes
completely.
Totally,
it, like literally, like the camera, if it had a camera, the camera would zoom out.
I was gonna say what camera?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
On the printouts.
Wow.
Cool.
So that showed me that like games could be almost anything, and like paradigm shifts are just really powerful. It was such a cool moment for me, like mind blown.
Yeah, are there big paradigm shifts like that in games? I mean, changing changing the playable character. What? Huh?
Hold on, I have a. So was this a purely player-run economy, type of thing, or like essentially some version of that? Yeah, I see.
So like. I mean, like EVE Online, there were like, so on the Southern Empire, for example, there were income streams like mining asteroids or whatever. But then like players would take care of like, you know, where to spend that and how they trade it and things like that. There was a lot of freedom with the players, and one of the nice things about it being so rudimentary was that they could add features super quickly. If you don't have to add graphics and you're literally just making text, you can add new things like all the time. So these games were like totally evolving in response to player feedback. So if players were like, we want a way to trade coins because we're making deals, they'd be like, yeah, like we'll do it manually until we get the functionality, and then we'll do it, you know, that way. Like they were super responsive in general.
See, what was the end goal of these games? Like, what did your turns actually comprise of, and what were you trying to do?
Yeah, so depending on the game, Beyond the Solar Empire was similar to EVE Online, where you're trying to take over as much of the space as you can. It's a Crime was like, I don't know, you were trying to become the most powerful mob boss in the world. A lot of them would boil down your success into a single number sometimes, and there'd be leaderboards. So it'd be like, oh, you know,
like territory or something,
70 prestige or whatever number they came up with. The next one I want to talk about is called Monster Island. And this one was, you would pick a race of monsters, which were all made up. Me and my friend were Beavis and Butthead fans at the time, and there was one called Big Nose was the name of the monster. So we made Big Noses called Boogerhead, and this is how old we were. Nice. And something else, like I think Beavis and Boogerhead or something. And then you would get this like turn where you wash up on the shore, and you basically just have this huge world in front of you. You don't know how to make anything. It's a survival game, but done cooperatively. And there are other players who've been playing for longer who are super advanced, who you might run into and like might help you out, might fight you. You don't know. And this game just like unfolded continually. Like there's so many mechanics that you just didn't know about in the beginning. But yeah, I brought an example of a turn. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. So this is what it would look like. It would have your address and everything. I don't live there anymore, so don't worry about that. And you can, and then you would basically, yeah. So like up here would be like your order. So all the orders would boil down to like a letter and a number. So T, I think, was travel. J was like jazzercise, which was how you got stronger. That's like a joke, but like was how you got stronger. Q is quest for knowledge. So that basically means that like, that means that you're just going to look around, and then based on what's in your inventory and what sort of square you're in, you will think about what you might be able to make. And then so it would be like, if you have a vine and you're in the swamp, you might figure out how to make a slingshot, those sorts of things. So like players would figure out like what the patterns were, and you would have to go to the right places with the right objects and then quest for knowledge. And now your character knows how to make that from then on.
And none of this was laid out in front of you. It's all kind of trial and error discovery. And
this is like a relatively boring, but this is what a map would look like. So they would literally print out like the map of where you've been recently and what you found there.
Can you hold it up one more time?
Oh yeah.
Beautiful.
And you can see the arrows is like the moves that I made that turn. So they show that on the map. And then there's like, this is the reference sheet where it's telling you like what all the activities you could do and like what the keywords are, because of course you'll forget. And then there's this was always the fun section. It's called blurbs. So basically anytime you run into a new concept, they put a blurb about it, and it's mostly like flavor, but sometimes it tells you information like, oh, this new weapon is going to be good against a certain monster type. So it was
Yeah.
really fun to like learn about the world through these blurbs. And then to your point, Regal, to your question, what is the end goal of Monster Island? So it was hard to say. Most of these games didn't have an endpoint. I know Travian and games like that do, where it's like collect all 4 artifacts or whatever, and then bring them to a certain gate or whatever, and then like the game is over and you start again. Most of these were built to go on forever. So usually the goal, at least Monster Island, the goal was just to get more powerful, get stronger, be the strongest in PvP. There'd be leaderboards usually for different things. So be like, I forget what the stats were, but like have the biggest schnoz or whatever. Like they literally had a stat that was like around like something to do with noses or whatever. And so like training certain things and like and getting, eventually you learn how to cast magic spells and so on and so forth, and that can help you. And there were like temples to explore. It just felt like every time you got further in the game, more mechanics opened up and more exploration opened up. So honestly, you didn't really know if there was an end point in some sense. It was kind of like MMOs, where it's like,
what's the longest game you played for?
I would say like 2 years. I probably played Monster Island
okay.
for.
Like on a weekly basis, weekly.
Yeah, weekly or bi-weekly.
Wow.
And like towards the end, it was getting pretty complicated, but in a cool way.
This is very interesting. I think so. It sounds to me the only experience I have with a game that's really like this, where like player to player interaction as well as like a lot of hidden mechanics involved are MUDs. The old school MUDs. I used to play one called Achaea, Dreams of Divine Lands, which no one has ever heard of. Also, very weird place for a 14-year-old to be. Anyway, I think it sounds. I would guess that like, so for context, what I'm thinking of is there were like in O Game or in like those similar types of like they're basically like precursors to the social media management games, right? Where or to like Clash of Clans, I guess, although I never played that game, where like everyone has like their own little piece of thing and you're sort of interacting with other players constantly. I think the problem that those games often run into is that like one person sort of snowballs, at least in the modern games. Like one person or one small group of people has complete domination, and new players are sort of on their own little thing, and they can't or will never hope to be that powerful. I think
yeah, real quick, I think like they actually benefited from the fog of war around information that existed at that time, because now when someone is in that position, you're seeing and hearing all about it, and you know that you are a small fish in a giant pond. But in that game, you could easily forget that because you were a big fish in your own pond, and you had no way, for the most part, of knowing, outside of like the leaderboard thing, which honestly they didn't really push on you in Monster Island, that you like the pond would grow as you grew, and so you always felt like the star of your own show, even though there were these other people. They were just like, you were small fries to them. It just like wasn't worth their time to even interact with you.
There was more surprise and mystery before the internet.
No, I get that. I didn't have access to the internet until I was like, well, I guess not that old, like 11, but I understand what it's like for the internet, kind of. So I think this game is cool. I would be interested in how the backend worked, but also,
actually,
I think
the guy who designed Monster Island, like I interact with him on Twitter back in the day. His name is Jack Everett, but he's still active on Twitter, and he's a cool dude. I mean, like I have so much respect for him building this game basically from scratch on his own, I think.
I think the one is the lack of information, but I think more importantly, the cadence of the turns is sort of what makes this whole thing run to me, if I was to guess, right? Because I think there's a lot of games that have tried to do this, like a lot of the modern open server, open world, like Minecraft, even to some extent, have this thing where like you're in a group of, you're put in this giant world and you're learning how to do stuff, and there's other players that can antagonize you or do their own thing or help you. But I think a lot of the sort of end game problems I'm thinking of stem from the fact that you're playing for 3 hours at a time, and in those 3 hours you take the equivalent of like 200 turns, right? And that's sort of the problem. I think that's goes to a higher problem where a lot of games have a fun concept that works at the beginning, but for some reason when it gets to the end game, it morphs and sort of what's fun like disappears, right? And I think the ability to do that spaced out, I think probably was a big part of why it held a lot of that mystique and fun throughout the process. I
Yeah,
wonder what happens when people quit, by the way. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, often they'll end up like gifting all their stuff to someone else, or like the. But yeah, I think modern gamers are, just, for better or worse, kind of hooked on immediacy in a lot of ways, and so it's hard to convince them to play a game where they have to wait a week between turns, even if it would be a really fun experience. Tiny Adventures did do really well, but even that was like 10 or 15 years ago at this point.
But I mean,
yeah.
forced waiting on turns is not something we don't do, right? Like the social games, browser games, or you
I would
can't.
say it's like, yeah, it's fallen into disfavor. I think I'm not as up to
Has it?
date, but like people generally hate energy systems because they're just like, I want to play the game when I want to play the game,
Yeah.
and you telling me I
Yeah.
can't play the game is kind of shitty of you. And like, I think public sentiment has really swung that way at this point.
Mm.
But it could be doable, and there are games that try to limit the amount you play. Usually these days, designers will give diminishing returns on what you can do with extra time in the game rather than hard locking you out.
Yeah, so it feels like I'm still playing, but I'm not really doing anything.
Everybody has their own point for like when it's not worth it anymore, and you just let the player find that. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, you've gotten all the gold you can get today, you've gotten all the quest rewards. Like, do you still want to play? Yeah, okay, sure.
Sure thing, pal. Enjoy.
I do think the existence of like fantasy football or like weekly D&D groups or weekly cube draft groups or whatever points to the fact like there's some energy that can be tapped into that people want. There is some desire to do something just once a week or just once a day. I just think, it maybe can't take the form of a traditional game.
Yeah, tying it to real world
for-
event really helps you out. Where it's like, of course, it's once a week because that's when the games are. So
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
But there's something there's something attractive about that, like spreading out all that decision load, right? Like,
Yeah.
For
I
sure,
think
it could be complicated, but it's only once a week. Like, all right, I can find the hour or two to do this in the week.
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind is asynchronous board games done digitally. So my friends and I, including Vagar, have been playing asynchronous digital game on our phones of Through the Ages for about 2 years now. And
Mhm.
every time a game ends, we start a new one immediately. And we know that people have real lives, so sometimes it takes people 2 or 3 days to take a turn, or even longer. And sometimes
Yeah.
people are taking turns rapid fire just based on the ebb and flow of our free time. And it's like perfect. It just fits into our lives however we want. And we love the fact that it's just constantly going. We love the game.
Yeah, I
So
loved
things like
that for a while, just with like the words with friends type simple shit. Like, I can just
Word
like,
of-
now this is the half an hour I have to do this, and I'm going to go through all of them, and then maybe in a couple days from now, I'll do it again.
Yeah, of
keep an
course,
eye on this year's holiday event.
Wordle is a great example of like where the turn a day has worked recently.
Yes.
And
Yes.
or connections they now have. They're kind of trying to dig back into that and see if they can.
Sorry, what is Wordle?
Wordle? Yeah. Do you know about it? It was a turn a
Yeah,
day.
no, I know.
We talked about it.
Cool. Yeah.
I think it's like the turn a day thing was so important. I think to what
Totally.
Wordle was.
Otherwise, people would have played like 7 in a row and then been like, "Oh, okay, I'm done. That's cool."
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
To your point, Regal, real quick. You were talking about the idea of like it's hard to make a game that like lasts to be interesting into the end game often, and there are a lot of problems. So like for the longest time, I have wanted to make an MMO with an end, is what I call it. And it's basically would be something where it's like you join an MMO server and like the game is designed to end after 2 months or so, and like you just are able to, and then like in the meantime the developers are working on new content for the future season essentially, and it's basically like every 2 months, like games can start whenever they want, but like every 2 months or so they sort of roll over the season to the next one. Now there's new things to explore and so on, and the games will end. So if there is a runaway leader or if there's an alliance that's too good, maybe do once a month, I don't know, then like the game, that there's always going to be another game that you can join.
I don't play MMOs these days, but don't they have like resets, season resets and things like that? Or is it not usually broken up that way because people don't want to lose their shit?
I guess Diablo is the closest to that idea, where they have seasonal characters.
Yeah, Path and Diablo, Path of Exile and Diablo, I think are quite similar to that, where you are basically just there's new content and you're starting over. I think expansions in traditional MMOs do something similar, but on a much slower cadence, on a 2-year cadence, right?
It's similar and it isn't though, because like in my head, a big part of it is that like in a game, in an MMO with an end, for example, if I do a quest in World of Warcraft, let's say there's a cataclysmic event that comes out of that quest, that happens for me, and then no one, now they have the what is it called, like zoning, the new feature where like I can always see it in the cataclysmic state even though
Oh
other
yeah.
people are seeing it in the normal state. They didn't used to have that, so it used to be that if I did the thing, it would go back to normal when I walked up next time. And so like you just can't have these like world changing events. But an MMO where like in a month it's going to be over, you can literally say that like the first person to do this quest permanently changes the world, and no one else can do that quest again. And now there's a whole new area that's unlocked and things like that.
Yeah, where the world really changes, so old things go away, meaning like some old parts go away and new parts come in.
Potentially, yeah. Like this quest giver literally just died, and like
Yeah.
now no one can do that quest
The
again
city
because they
was
were murdered as
smashed
part
by
of
a
this
meteor.
narrative.
Yeah.
In this another problem that comes out of that in traditional MMOs is that like the old zones always stick around and the old content always sticks around, which actually I think becomes a burden in many ways, right? Like a maintenance burden, as well as just like you have to find ways to get old players to do this content to help new players out, and it becomes a giant pain. So
yeah,
but I think actually Yip also proposed the same idea, and I think
he did, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And I think which I guess probably comes from the same place, for the same discussion that you all had at some point. I think but I think he highlighted what I think is the actual problem, which is for an MMO, the cost of building this is extremely prohibitive, right? Like you can't, like the cost of spinning up the infrastructure is so high that it really, I think, doesn't work to throw things away like that.
Well, an MMO's go ahead.
It's hard to convince a AAA studio to take that risk.
Yeah, that's what I was
gonna
say. Yeah.
Yeah.
MMOs are expensive to make and maintain, so there's somebody writing the checks, and they're very unlikely to be people who would go for a novel idea like that. That's not like, all right, yeah, but we get to keep all of our shit going, and it just adds that, right?
You mentioned Minecraft, though. It would surprise me if some indie company eventually makes a really low budget, low production value version of this that is fun, and then it inspires people to try to make the actual AAA one. But
they got it right the first time.
The AAA one. So I think there's actually two ways to think about this. So one thing is, I think this is basically D&D, right? Like what you're basically describing is like if you take the core way D&D works, where it's like, oh, you're starting a new adventure and it runs for a certain amount of time, and there's like curated content that's like not like crappy random generated content, but there's curated content for you and your group, and you have everything you do has a lasting effect on the world, and you're the protagonist, right? And everything is catered to you. I think if you take that core idea and put it in an MMO, I think that it's more or less what you're describing, where the campaign has to end at some point, and then we can flush all the old stuff and be done with it. So I
mean, I mean, that's like, isn't that just like a single player games? Like that's
it's a single player game.
To be clear, I'm not advocating to like make an entirely new story with entirely new content every time. I think a lot of things would invariably be used again as like as Fortnite and seasons. Much of the map stays the same, but they find really high impact things to change that follow some sort of narrative cataclysmic event. So like something like that, where the narrative moves forward in an interesting way, and then the world updates to be that. But like I think it is also important that like prior knowledge can help you. So like people would start to optimize their leveling routes and things like that, and that actually is kind of interesting to a point where it's like I've become good at this game because this is my fourth cycle through it or whatever, and I have
limits how far ahead the old timers can get, so that there's more opportunity for new players.
Yeah,
and
I'm at least starting at where you are.
And I think more important than that, it limits it puts a lot less pressure on the designer or on the design of the game to have a balanced end game, because when there's time cut off, you don't need the end game to be balanced. You don't need a whole team. Like I think probably at some point World of Warcraft had like whole teams dedicated to a single class, right? Like what is the rotation of this class at the end game, and how can we make sure that the optimal rotations are balanced with all the other classes? And I think it just takes a lot of the pressure off of that.
It also becomes this cool story where it's like, remember season 3 when the dragon egg was just ridiculous, and if you had one, you killed everybody else just by looking at them. And it's like, well, that was in subsets. It's a lot less painful when it lasts for 3 days instead of like 2 months of the remaining season.
Right. Yeah. I think instead of being an MMO, where every player is like given this content, I think this has legs as something that is a tool, like one of the D&D tools that exists, where a play group or basically like an ecosystem where you have an engine that renders the same world with the same physical location or something like that, maybe even the same generic set of NPCs, and then like some kind, basically the equivalent of a dungeon master is able to use modding tool, basically make a mod, or to download someone else's mod to make a campaign that goes through this, and to cater it for their own play group with their own systems. I think that sounds potentially more sustainable than like a true MMO, but it also does undercut the ability to spin a global narrative, right? Because that sort of can hurt the ability. Like one of the cool things about seasons is that like everyone's on the same season, so you have people sharing what their experience was in the season, and everyone else understands what they're talking about. But
Yeah, I think you also cut your potential player base a lot because you need every group that wants to play to have a friend who wants to DM, which is its own sort of skill. But like, I've always been fascinated by what you're talking about too, like players creating content for their players and their friends, and also the idea of like kind of like Left 4 Dead PvP, where like some players are playing as monsters is another mechanic I've always found to be fascinating. Or playing
I
as
love
NPCs.
that stuff.
Yeah,
Like
I think that's still really underexplored in some ways.
Me too. Like the Friday the 13th kind of idea.
Okay.
I forget what I was going to say. Go on.
One more quick play mail game. It's the last one I want to talk about. It's arguably my favorite, so I think it's worth getting into at least quickly. It's called Duel Masters. Ironically, I eventually worked on a game called Duel Masters at Wizards of the Coast.
Not that Duel Masters? Okay.
Yeah, so I did work on that, and I also worked on the Neopets TCG. Those are the two games I decided to work
Whoa,
on.
you worked in the Neopets TCG?
Yeah,
I fucking
cards.
I like my friend
up.
and I fucking went. We like somehow convinced someone's mom to drive us to the mall under some pretense to go to Limited 2 to buy the first set of the Neopets TCG.
Amazing. Yeah, that was really fun. I was great at Neopets, and by that I mean I wrote a lot of scripts to like buy all the rare stuff because I wasn't smart enough to figure out how to actually buy them, but I had scripts running on my Wizards of the Coast computer that would like alert me and like play a sound and turn the browser tab red whenever a rare item would show up in the shops, which was 100% RNG for the most part. And so I had so much money in Neopets. I did feel a little bad for like the 8-year-old kids I was.
Yeah, I was going to say, how old were you when you were doing writing scripts to buy up all the good shit?
23 or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
My Neopet was stacked though.
Take that. You played Neopets quite a bit too, right?
If you're interested in Neopets, check out this year's holiday event.
Okay.
Anyway, yes, I played Neopets. Was my first like real game. I think I was actually like 7 or 8 when I first started playing. I played
6.
Yep.
And he tried to get the rare stuff in the auction house, but it always got bought up right away.
My brain almonds were not developed enough to understand anything that was going on. Like when you're that, like looking back at that age, like everything was just like a blur of color. I was just like, oh, Codestone, bye.
I remember trying to play like text adventure games at that age, and looking back, I was like, I didn't know half of the words I was looking at.
Yeah, same.
So yeah, interestingly, Duel Masters. Oh, go ahead.
I was just at that. I also didn't speak English for a good part of that, where like I was still learning English, so double whammy.
That's a setback, yeah.
So yeah, Duel Masters, Wizards of the Coast ended up paying Reality Simulations a large sum of money to change the name of the play-by-mail game in like a weird full circle thing for me. And so it is now called Duel 2 because the name Duel
Instead
Masters
of Duel Masters.
It used to be Duel Masters with a space was the play-by-mail game. Duel Masters with no space was the card game. But like that was obviously confusing. So there was like a patent battle or trademark battle.
Duel 2.
Yes, they paid the money and it's now Duel 2. Because like
Master Duel.
The amount of money that Wizards cared about from Duel Masters sales was like a lot of money, or like that they barely cared about was a lot of money to the small play-by-mail game companies.
Yeah,
so that was the way they solved it. But anyway, real quick. So Duel 2 / Duel Masters was a gladiatorial combat play-by-mail game where you had a stable of gladiators and you didn't really know what their stats were. You had to kind of figure it out by playing. And by putting them into fights, and then you kind of had to, and so like the fight would literally just be text, as with all of these things. And we added suspense to this by putting another paper over top of the fight, and you would scroll it down slowly as you're reading, so you couldn't peek ahead. And it would literally be like, so and so slashes with his sword, which sounds really lame, but at the time it was actually really great, and the writing was really good, and the fights were like really interesting. And
it's fun revealing it with the paper.
Yeah, and your turn cards would be like, okay, in round 1, I'm going to aim aim at their right leg, and in round 2 I'm going to go for the head, and then I'm going to defend my left leg and then my left arm, and then I'm going to like spend 7 out of 10 energy in round 1 and then go back to 3 out of 10 in round 2. I'm going to be really defensive, so it's all this stuff. And then you could challenge specific fighters, so you could try and build your strategy to beat someone else with a good ranking or whatever. And then one thing that I really enjoyed had the newspaper thing and so on and so forth. I guess I should say 2 more things. One is that the goal of this one was to, your fighters could die, and they could also just not do well enough, but your goal was to essentially prestige them. So if they did well enough and they were kind of rose to the top of their local arena, they would graduate up to a tournament of champions. And if they won that, they would become immortal, and they would go on to this extra prestige layer of the game that was only immortal top fighters could ever achieve. And then you could fight with them as long as you wanted in there, but it was really, really hard.
Interesting. I had a question about all these, because you have guilds that have secrets and things. Were there spies and moles in these play-by-mail games?
100% everybody on the Stellar Empire, because all the space games always do. In fact, me and one of my friends had this incredible, I think it was O game. We had one of those moments where we infiltrated a faction and told them the whole thing, that they needed to send their ships to this planet, and we blew it up at the exact moment when they got there. It was this huge,
I love it.
We killed like 200 ships, and there was debris everywhere for a long time afterwards. So yeah, that was, I mean, just
I like that. I love that stuff.
We were in their Discord when it happened, and just like watching all the messages of them being like, "Is it bugged? Like, what happened? The server's not loading." It was like such a big fight that it actually like slowed down the server. They're like, "I think it's broken. Our ships are still there. Don't worry. Our ships are definitely still there. It's fine."
That's great that you can just see all their reactions too. Like, that's fun.
I felt a little bad, but it's so good.
It's a game.
Yeah, exactly.
Got him.
Okay, so the last thing I want to say about Duel Masters, I love this. If you didn't like a fighter, because again, you couldn't see their stats, but you could get a sense for them, a little bit like Pokemon, the thing. Well, now they're visible, but they weren't. Then you could send them to their death. So you would literally like check off a thing, and it would put them up against this like incredibly difficult NPC monster. So it'd be like so and so against the hill troll or against the Medusa. And then there's a small infinitesimal chance that they just go full hero mode and actually come out with the win. In which case you're like, maybe this guy's not so bad after all. You are definitely going back in the roster, and then you try and figure out like what the magic was and see if you can like capture that. But most of the time they just die. Like they just have a very quick fight where it's just like they just get murdered and they are dead, and you get to do. And the reason you do that is because now you can roll up a new character essentially. But yeah, I found that game to be so fun, and that's the one that still is at the conventions to this day. I think they still run it at Gen Con even now.
How many people play these things? Do you have any idea what sort of audience there could possibly be?
Yeah, I went to their website earlier today, and I think I saw a number that was like around 10,000. I'm sure that's not exactly accurate, but I think that's like the number of people that have logged into the forum ever or something.
Okay.
So that seems like about right to me.
Sounds right, yeah.
Yeah. It definitely was never took the world by storm, but like to people who were in the know, it was amazing.
Oh, it's cool. Yeah.
And then back to the story about how you got into Magic. That was how I found out about Magic, was through play-by-mail games, because they got into the business of selling Magic cards as a way to supplement their income. So they would include a flyer inside the play-by-mail turn saying like, hey, there's this new game called Magic. We think it's really good, and you could buy stuff. And I literally have a flyer that says that you can buy a limited Mox Pearl for $30.
Whoa.
That's how early this was. So that's worth like, I don't even know, $5,000 or $10,000 now, Joe.
Is that like a banned card or something?
No, it's one of the Power 9. It's one of the most
Power 9, yes.
Yeah, it's one of the Power 9 from like the very early days. Like before they kind of knew what they were doing. Or sorry, to fully tell that tale, it's basically that like in the beginning they thought that not everyone would have access to all the cards, and they thought that rare cards would truly be rare. Like maybe your play group would have access to like 1 or 2 of the rare cards, and that's it. And you would be known for being the person that had a specific card. Little did they know people were going to spend thousands of dollars and just buy everything. So they intentionally made some of the rare cards really powerful. And now they know that's not a good idea, but at the time it was intentional.
This is a perfect example we were talking about earlier of like having to balance for the end game, right? Like because totally. When you make Magic cards now, you have to balance with the idea that everyone's going to have access to everything, and everyone's going to know what the best cards are and what all the cards are. You can't make these completely overpowered cards that are somehow unique unless you ban them, or you just do it anyway, which they have done recently. But
yeah, I think I've always thought that like another underexplored space in digital TCGs, and like some games have tried to do it, Marvel Snap a little bit, but like like customizable things based on accomplishments with a given card. Like if the world champion got like if you could literally like right click on a specific card in someone's collection that they play against you and see that it was used to win the world championship and it has like some cool
Their
emblem on it
history
because of that.
and everyone.
Yeah, or like the number of times they've cast it, or there's like so many stats that you could attach to cards that like
Nobody
I think
does this.
not really. Designers always talk about it. I think it always gets discounted as being a little too expensive on the database side. I mean, which is a reasonable argument, honestly, because it is, it adds a lot of data to track all this information about every game that's ever been played. But honestly, a lot of that is in the database already in terms of like, tracking histories of games and so
It's
on.
And
So-
does
so
it add any?
Dota does this with some cosmetic items. There's a lot of cosmetic items that have
That
achievements
tracking
attached to them.
Counter-Strike. Yeah.
Yep, Counter-Strike also does.
Yeah, they make it into a thing that like upgrades the value of your cosmetic.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool too.
It is nice.
And the one example in the card game I know of is the what do you call it? The World Champion promo card they do in Magic, where they put the face of the World Champion on one of the cards. And that's sort of
cool.
like a prestige thing, but that is pretty rare. The idea of like how do you think a limited information game could possibly work in today? Like, do you think it's even remotely possible? We're thinking about, because I can't. It's hard for me to imagine that being possible now.
Does
The
it have
only
to be
way-
live?
Even
Just
if it's
you.
not live, just with internet and Discord and everything.
Yeah, the only ways I can think of are like one, you make it a really bad idea mechanically to share information, and the thing I can think of with that is I think Ultima Online or some other game like that, one of the early MMOs, actually did this, which was really cool. They made it so that the efficacy of your spells depended on how few people had cast them recently. So the more people that
Oh,
found
wow.
out how to cast it actually made your spell worse. So they incentivize players to keep it secret. But that only works for so long because like eventually someone leaks it and then everyone has it once the internet has it, right?
But then that also doesn't that also balance it? It makes the spell
Well, it becomes a
weaker
spreadsheet
and
at
weaker?
some point. I think.
Yeah, at some point it's like all spells are known by everyone. So all spell, yeah, I guess it does. I guess yeah, that does get to another thing that I've always found fascinating is like this idea of dynamically balancing an RTS.
Yeah, right.
Some games have tried a little bit, but basically you could say like there's a script that runs every night that checks how many times each unit has been built that previous day, and then
Yeah.
if it's been built over the average, it literally reduces the stats by a little bit, and if it's been built less than the average, it increases the stats. And then every day you wake up and the RTS game is balanced differently than it was the night before, based on
Some
actual.
people would argue that this is how League of Legends is currently balanced.
Yeah, I
Oh,
can't
what?
comment on that.
I'm just kidding. No, I think that's interesting. I think one, I think that kind of thing just opens itself a lot to bad actors, essentially, or like
Yeah.
in ways that you don't expect it to work. Like people trying to manipulate the system in all kinds of different ways that would happen if. That was-
Yeah, I have one other idea. It's not great, but like basically you make a game where like the tech tree is procedurally generated every single time you play it, and maybe you combine that with like the MMO with an end idea. So it's like you're playing on a server that lasts for 2 weeks, and every single time there's a bunch of RNG that is used in creating the world, creating the tech tree, creating which strains are even in the game. And so it's like, and like generating even maybe procedurally generating spells or something. Like you could go pretty far, especially with how powerful AI is getting in terms of content generation. And then it's like it's literally a puzzle that you have to resolve and remake wikis every single time you play.
Yeah.
So
I do
Right.
think AI is a good idea for this, just because I think the limitations of the current or like previous procedural generation, I think it would be fairly easy for a dedicated player base to figure out like a formula to get through, to get to where you want to go and kind of boil it down to something simple. I do think on that note, actually, the idea of something that starts over, like a persistent world that also starts over, especially for a small play group, could do this, where you're just getting new content, and it's unfamiliar content, and that can get there.
Should we wind our way back to RNG topics?
Yeah, I have
I have 7 more positives, 7 more positives, and 6 negatives or so. So
okay.
Wow.
We'll see.
I think a lot
We'll
about
have
this.
we're gonna need 3 more episodes, I think.
Yeah.
So way earlier on, we were talking about the Legion Legendary system and how in a pity timer, and I wanted to explore what happens when you make everything into a pity timer. This is in the realm of an RPG or an MMO. Right? I think this is something that people feel like they want a lot, which is like, why do I have to grind this stupid ent to get this drop why can't you just turn everything into a point, right? Like you get every time the ent dies, you get 3 ent coins, and then you go to the shop and you can buy whatever you want as long as you have the ent coins. Like, what do you lose when you make this system?
Yeah, I mean the immediate answer is like the viscerality of getting the thing that you want when you loot the monster, both in terms of thematically, like MMOs are trying to get that sense of like you're literally rifling through their backpack and picking an item off of them. And so I assume this is why, I don't know for World of Warcraft how much they've done this by now, but like they're at various points in its history they have done things where you get a coin that you then turn into the vendor and then you pick the item that you want. But it just feels so much worse in the moment. That like high moment is deferred.
It takes away the surprise, the delight of the drop.
Anytime you go more deterministic in some way, you're sort of giving up that surprise and delight aspect. But
a similar example is some gacha games have tried to do this, and I think people really hate it, where instead of getting a bunch of it, when you want a specific like unit out of when you're throwing your money, instead of getting a specific unit, you get like some number of tokens for that unit, and you need to just like add those tokens up to 100 to get the thing. And I think people, myself included, really hate that because of what you said. Like you totally lose the moment of like, oh, I either have it or I don't. Instead, it becomes a grind, right? Like everything becomes a grind where you're trying to add numbers up rather than looking for you're never going to get the jackpot, essentially, right?
Yeah, you're right. There's a reason there's YouTube videos or whatever, like TikTok things about these gacha games are, oh, I pulled a 5-star or pulled 5 stars in the same pack. You're never going to get that with, oh, I got the less 10 coins I needed to buy this 5-star from the shop.
Yeah.
And I think one other thing this completely loses is the ability to force a player to adopt something other than what they think is the best or the optimal thing, right? Because if you're able to just buy stuff from a shop, everyone that does the equivalent of net decking in whatever domain that you're in is just going to do that thing, right? And they're just going to say, oh, what is the best? I can't make this decision. There's too much stuff to read. If there's like 10 things in the shop, it's like, I don't want to make this decision. I don't want to read all these words and think about all these implications. Just tell me what the best thing is and I will buy that. And I think that's when you have a drop, you take the choice paralysis out of the player in some ways, right? Where it's like, okay, well, now you just have this thing and you only need to understand this one thing, and it's up to you whether you want to use it.
Yeah, and that's especially devastating in like a PvP TCG in the early game, especially where it's like you're just playing against the same deck all the time because everyone's going for whatever the accepted best thing is.
Yeah,
which still happens in like obviously like developed meta games when players have all the cards, but at that point, hopefully players are more resilient to it if they're still.
Yeah, this is more of a problem in multiplayer games more so, right? Like single player games, I like it when they force you to use the different builds, but there's definitely a feeling in a PvP game that it's like, I'm still behind though. I'm not just different. I'm doing it wrong. Unless you're a confident person.
Well, the thing is, the low tier pickers are actually some of the most annoying people to play against because they often pick low tiers because they want an excuse for when they lose. They want to protect their ego.
Right. I'm playing Dan or whatever, so of course I lost.
Yeah. I'm playing this bad brew. I don't know, man. You're net decking and you beat me. Congratulations.
Yeah, I guess people do that, but it's yeah.
Yeah, I haven't.
But you play those things so you play Dan so that you can win and get bragging rights. Not
that's bad too. That's annoying too.
Oh, I'm that guy. Of course.
Yeah, you're that guy.
I love beating people with Dan.
That tracks. I do too. I like. I'm very much a Johnny Spike, I guess, where like I really enjoy playing my own brews, often combo decks, but then winning with them. Obviously, like I really try to win as hard as I can. But like
But you're also very good and can do that. Like I often feel. I mean, we've played gacha games together, Regal. I'm like, I can't figure this out.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
What cheats are for?
Yeah,
see, this is
that's why I joined his guild.
Whenever competitiveness gets introduced, I think this is what happens, right? Like there's suddenly all this pressure to get onto the meta and to perform, and I think that pressure can often strip away a lot of what the designer intended to be fun or interesting or creative because of that external pressure, right?
Yeah, classic problem for designers. It's like, how do you combat
that? So is there some other reward that you get for branching out? I don't know.
Earlier we were talking about the appeal of using the appeal of limiting a player's access to resources so that they're forced to do things, especially in a collaborative setting. And I think gacha games, as we were just talking about, is a good example of that, because for the vast majority of players, the purpose or like a lot of the fun brewing part of the game is made or is because the access to stuff they have is limited by the gacha, right? Like it's prohibitively expensive for 99.9999% of players to have everything. And so the content and the fun is sort of designed around giving a player access, or the randomness in the system is made to give the player access to a very small subset of things, or to not very, but to a small subset of things, and have them figure out how to combat, how to achieve challenges based on what they have, right, and not based on what is the best.
Yeah, and another classic tactic I've seen, and I believe it's in Puzzle and Dragons, although I didn't play very much in AFK Arena. I think used it as well, really well, which is that you design rotating weekly challenges that are very sharp.
It's in every game.
And yeah, okay, good. And then basically, you need to have a wide variety of characters to some degree, or at least and you announce it sometimes a week in advance so players can work towards having a good team for next week's dungeon or whatever. Which is it's just a classic tactic for any, I guess we would call, horizontal progression game, where there's a lot of different axes you're progressing on, a lot of different characters that you progressively give people a lot of short and midterm goals to go along with their
Wait, so
collectibles.
just to make sure I'm understanding, you're talking about a multiplayer game that has single player or co-op challenges that forces you to use other builds.
Kind of. So often it's actually single player still. So this would be something like a gacha game is often. They have co-op and multiplayer aspects, but generally you could consider them as mostly single player. It's mostly you against the environment, or the game is creating challenges for you, and you are building a team to destroy those challenges. So generally in those games, you're going to build your core team, which is going to be your go-to for most things. But then the game is going to throw these really, when I say sharp, meaning vulnerable in a specific way and really strong in a specific way. So a classic example is they're going to throw these ice monsters at you next week, and regular swords just don't do very much damage to them, but if you have fire, you're going to crush them. And so now your goal is go out and collect the best fire team that you can, because the weekly dungeons have really good loot, and that sort of helps your main team get even further ahead,
right,
which is kind of your core goal.
And another way to put that is I guess traditionally, from my background, you would think of those things as there are things that have hard counters, right? Where like the Pokemon TCG, I think had, I don't know what it's like now, but had what I think was historically a problem, where there were the type matchups in that game made for very hard counters, and it was difficult to win a losing type matchup regardless of everything else. I don't know what that's like now. I assume they changed that at some point, but
I think that's still.
It might be key to the game. It might be key to everything. I don't know.
I think that's still true, but Pokemon at this point has become such a combo game that you're just doing crazy, powerful things anyway. So it's less about doing damage, I think, but I'm not sure. I've actually never played Pokemon TCG.
I've not played since I was a child, but so yeah, I it's still doing well apparently. But yeah, anyway,
Pokemon Juggernaut.
Yeah, so I think that specific design can be problematic sometimes, though, right? Because it's sort of there's a balance between guiding a player towards doing something, or incentivizing them to use something that's normally underutilized, and sort of enforcing that that's the only way to go. And I think it's hard to find that balance.
Yeah, it definitely makes people who have an underdeveloped collection, most likely because they don't have a lot of money to spend,
right,
because they are not going to be able to build a very strong team to take on those challenges. So it's a rich get richer thing in a way, right, people who have the money to put in. But of course, they don't mind that, I'm guessing, in some cases, because they are going to make more money from people who are spending money to develop a fire team and an ice team and a rock team. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, every sort of game like that has to decide how much they're willing to put weight onto cash spending, and how much they want you to be able to play it for free.
Yeah. I wonder, can you think of other ways you can incentivize horizontal progression other than having sharp mechanics or hard counters, as it were?
Yes, a common one is like synergies, not quite the right word, but
Okay.
like basically the idea would be that like maybe you just passively, like let's say for every character you get to level 50, the rest of your team passively gets a little bonus. Or like you have a bench that you can put 4 characters on that are passively contributing to your army but are not actually out on the field. And then depending on if you want to just incentivize collection, if you also want to incentivize progression, you could have that bonus scale with their level or not, depending. But yeah, there's lots of, and then like I've seen games do things like as your collection gets larger, you unlock bonuses. There's essentially some sort of like progression tracker or like, sorry, collection tracker that's leveling up, and there are thresholds at which point like you get bonuses which allow you to make your character stronger along the way. So there's so many ways to do it depending on like how directly you want to. Um, and then, I mean, to our point earlier, you can essentially force players to sort of like spec wider by just giving them things that they didn't want, and then also then incentivizing them to use them somehow. There's a bunch of ways you could do that, but like players, and I think like players generally react well to that as long as it's not too heavy-handed, because the game is more fun when you are playing a wider variety of comps. But of course, players, when given the chance, will just play their strongest comp every single time. So you have to find it's definitely a balance there.
You do a lot of it does come down to you fighting, or the player fighting against themselves, right? Like you forcing the player to do something that's more fun, even though they don't want to.
I think you're right, Paul, that like most people probably, I mean, why wouldn't you, I suppose, gravitate towards the thing that works,
Totally.
unless I'm forced a little bit or there's something really pulling me like it looks awesome.
Yeah, you have to very gently force them to do the thing that they don't want to do, and then they will probably enjoy it themselves more.
Yeah, I'm that way. Like God of War, you get 5 different weapon types, but the one you start with has the most experience. And if you don't have a great reason to use the bow, like far away enemies, I'm not gonna.
My favorite mechanic in this vein is like Modern Warfare 2. We talked about that earlier, Swimfan, and I've loved how they did the sort of like weapon achievements, because basically every weapon had its own achievements associated with it, and like each one, when you first switch to it, you would get them super rapid fire. Like you'd play a game and you'd get like 5 achievements immediately, but the rewards are very small. But you didn't really notice that. You just kind of like, but then as you start using that weapon more, it's longer and longer between bonuses. But when you do get one, it's worth a lot. And so when you're tired of not unlocking anything, you switch to a different weapon, and now you get to do that rapid fire thing again. And then we're like, okay, I want some bigger rewards now. You go back to the one you like. And I just found it was like a really compelling way to like switch between weapons at your own pace, and it wasn't forcing you; it's letting you make your own decisions. So it felt like you were doing it, but you were still again having more fun.
And there were just also so many things to unlock. It felt like you could like you said, go switch to a new handgun or whatever, and you hear that like level up sound.
And sometimes the thing you unlocked would actually add to your efficacy with an old weapon. So like the one I remember the most is the noob tube, which was the grenade launcher thing you could attach to your rifle or shotgun or something. And so when you finally unlock the shotguns, when you finally unlocked that was like it was a great reason to go back and play it, like use shotguns again for a while until you get tired.
It changes the game. It reminds me of with handguns, you eventually unlock the tactical knife. The ability to hold a knife with your other hand.
That's right. I remember that moment. It's like
that's like the fast stab. So that I was the annoying
I was a big
constantly running stabbing build because it was overpowered.
That's true. Yeah, noob tubes and knifing was like my strat, and like all the sprinting skills and everything. But yeah, that game nailed rewards, I think, really, really well.
I mean, that was around the same time as. I mean, that was the second iteration of the perk system too. Like it was a lot of good stuff.
I love that game.
It makes me think of
kill streaks.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna. I've never played a Call of Duty game, unfortunately.
You can't.
That's true.
Get sick of war.
That's definitely true. But
can't blame you.
What was I talking about? I'm thinking about Israel.
I'm putting an important sound effect in the general chat.
Sure. I'll keep talking. You guys can check it out. So in the gacha game I currently play, which is Blue Archive, it I never thought about this in these terms before, but it makes a lot of sense to me because the most recent. So in this game, the fights are all on a timer. Like all the fights are on a timer. So the fight will end not when your team. Well, the fight also ends when your team dies, but instead of dying, the fights also end when the timer ends. And the most recent endgame content they put out was to make have the same endgame boss with the same mechanics and not make it harder, but just like triple or quadruple their health. And I think that was thinking about it more. That makes a lot of sense because that incentivizes endgame players to now invest in these second or third rate units because the game also has a very deep domain, deep collection, deep pool of units. It incentivizes players to make these invest in these second or third rate units, and also even if you want, you can just throw like 7 teams at the thing, and to beat it instead of beating it optimally, and it sort of gives you a reason to put once you have your main team maxed out, it gives you a reason to put more into the rest of it.
Yeah, it's a good idea for how to incentivize wider collection too. Is you allow multiple goes at the same challenge or whatever. You allow you to swap in another team and do damage on top of what the first team did.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of games I've played that do the thing you mentioned, Paul, where it's like if I use all the other weapons and abilities, like when I master it, I get like a +1 agility for all my characters or whatever. I know I've seen that a lot, but I can't think of examples.
Me neither. I think AFK Arena has some form of that.
I think Azure Lane might have some version of that, but I never played that game. Okay, Paul, how about you read off one of your ideas?
Ooh, show Cat.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Cat.
Google. His brother Totoro is probably downstairs, but maybe he'll show up at some point.
Google the cat.
Yep. So I can go through them quickly. And this is something that, I used to actually have an interview question when I was interviewing potential systems designers about why does StarCraft use fixed damage and Warcraft use random damage, which I think is actually a really interesting question that is really hard to answer fully. It took me like years of asking that question and like thinking about it deeply before I finally felt like I had a full answer. But go ahead, what are you gonna say?
That's interesting. Well, I obviously haven't thought about this yet, but so what would you say the differences at a high level between StarCraft and Warcraft are? Because to someone who's unfamiliar, they're both just RTS games.
Space.
Yeah, I mean, Warcraft has the whole environment aspect where it's like you're creeping, I think it's called. And it's very much about like the fantasy or the fantasy thematic where your heroes have inventory and you can collect loot, which makes them more powerful, and they are named characters who are getting stronger. Whereas StarCraft is much more about like mass produce lots of disposable units.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But it's also very much sci-fi and so on.
Okay, so my first thought as an answer then is that the units in StarCraft are not supposed to have identities, or I guess I don't know if that's the right word, but they're not really supposed to be characters. They're supposed to be chess pieces, right, that you move around. And so you want to be able to accurately predict exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to act and who's going to win this fight when I put X Marines against X Y Hydralisks. And I guess in Warcraft, the units, you're supposed to have much fewer units. You're supposed to have a specific comp, and especially the heroes, you want the variance in moments when you feel like they're able to do something bigger than what they were supposed to, or a high impact moment that was unexpected in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I mean, that's a great answer. A lot of it is about the thematic of the game. To your point, like the Warcraft, like I said, like you're collecting loot, which is by definition random. I mean, they could have it be fixed, but they do have it be random. And so like the heroes are getting these random power spikes where they get these consumable items that you're going to use in a fight to try to turn the tide of battle. And like a lot of the skill in Warcraft is like anticipating what your opponent might have. So there's a lot, they lean into unknowns in Warcraft, where StarCraft is very much, it's also an audience difference in a way. I'm sure the games both appealed to, there's a lot of overlap obviously between who plays both of them, but I do think that like StarCraft is going for more meticulous people who really want, like you said, to have really defined outcomes when two units fight and to know exactly what they're doing and be able to react to that. And Warcraft is more appeals to people who do love that RPG fantasy where characters are getting stronger in a way that's hidden to your opponent, and then in every game plays out a little bit differently, to the point about variability from RNG. I think in some sense, I think both games have a ton of legs, but like in that arena specifically, Warcraft has more legs because you do have more variability in each given matchup and each given time that you play.
I think one point I would add to that even is that the fights in Warcraft play out differently. Any
Right.
two fights between any two of the same compositions can play out differently every time, like noticeably differently. Whereas in StarCraft, that doesn't usually happen, and you don't want that to happen, right? Because
Right.
you sort of want to deploy your units and sort of go back, like you want to have the fight and then switch back to your production during the fight because you know how it's going to end. Whereas in
Yep.
Warcraft, so I think a very similar thing is like, why do all the units in Warcraft have skills, like
Right.
very
I
high
was just gonna
impact
say
skills?
that.
Yeah.
Building on that, yeah, exactly. Because you have all those skills, especially on your heroes, but also you have the consumable items and so on and so forth, active items. You're able to react to changes in what happens in the battle much more so than StarCraft. In StarCraft, you could just press the same buttons that you already had 2 seconds ago. There's like nothing special about what you're doing for the most part.
Is there not like micro play in those battles that can turn the tide? Like if you're skilled enough?
But I think that the first of all, the micro in StarCraft is much more fast paced, where you're doing like twitch actions all the time, and you're being as efficient as possible because the battles are over very quickly. I use in StarCraft 2. This is also a big complaint about StarCraft 2, but in StarCraft 1 it's slightly different. But in Warcraft, the battles are much more slow paced. I think this is also
So
why
you have time to hit your skills.
The
and
units
consumables?
have way more HP, like 4 times more HP relative to attack compared to StarCraft. And so, and almost every core unit has like some kind of, well, maybe not every, like half the core units have some kind of active ability where you're able to individually choose what to cyclone, right? You have like 4 cyclones in the fight because you have 4 dots. You individually choose what to cyclone every time. As you're watching the battle play out, it's more of like a strategic turn-based thing, whereas StarCraft is much more of a twitch thing.
I know there weren't heroes in the same way, but was there variable damage in Warcraft 1 and 2, or was this a 3 difference?
I'm pretty sure there was, yeah. Another reason that it works really well for Warcraft is thematic reasons. So basically, like they use it as a way. It also increases design space too. They use it as a way to differentiate types of units. So like units that deal lightning damage tend to have really high variability in how much damage they're going to do.
No, this is good. This is good. Keep them on
there. And they often like, so they can get these massive crits where like they happen to roll at the high end of their damage range and then crit on top of that. And they lean into that with like, there's a hero called like the Chaos Lord or something that had like just like does like 1 to 40 damage with his attack, and it's just known that like if you're fighting against this guy, like you just have to react to what's going to happen. Whereas like StarCraft is all if 2 units fight, it's going to have the same outcome every time, with the exception of micro. To your point.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in Warcraft 2 because I bounced off after that, but I remember nailing your active abilities was what turned everything. Like getting your wizard in position to do his big ice storm or whatever.
And to the point about design space, like random damage allows you to design, let's say, a unit that does 3 to 5 damage every second, and a unit that does 2 to 6 damage or 1 to 7 damage every second, and they would feel like significantly different units, especially if they also had totally different art and totally different thematics, even though they're doing exactly the same DPS. So you actually can build more. Yeah, it's easier to build more units in that world, which is
I would guess that can only work if the attack speed is slow, right? It sort of goes something to do with crits that we'll talk about, where like for the you need to have fewer individual instances of damage to be able to notice that if the DPS is the same.
Yeah, kind of like poker. It's like the more hands you deal out, the more the variance fades away. That's true.
Was there attack damage difference in League? There's not, right?
Not anymore. I don't think so.
Okay.
No, I don't think there ever was.
I don't think there ever was either. There is in Dota. I'm curious whether you now would think, if you're starting over with League, whether you think it's a good idea to put it back in.
Off the cuff, I would say no. I'd have to think about it more. My gut is that like the characters are already so differentiated because they have these like four strong. It's not like you have a whole suite of creeps of minions on your side like you do in Warcraft that you can build. Because in that world, it does help to like differentiate them. But because every character in League of Legends that be controlled by the player is this like extremely unique character with four distinct abilities and crazy, crazily different art and so on, and crazy different identity. I don't know that you need the design space help at least. And I think you are catering to like these competitive players who really want to be able to sort of like calculate these moments, and you also have the abilities. Yeah, I don't know, but I would want to think about it more. It's interesting.
Yeah. To that note, I think one of the things this system also buys you is it again takes the burden of calculation off of the player if that comes up. So, for example, if you're last hitting in Dota 2 or League of Legends, you
Right,
you
totally.
don't really want. Well, last hitting maybe not a good example, but basically you don't want it to be a case where the player knows exactly I'm going to do 53 damage and I have to figure out how much HP the unit has and like somehow boil that down to a calculation that's predetermined. I think it's more fun generally to go by feel. And so having that damage range kind of tells the player you can't calculate it, so don't even try to. That may not work at the end game level because that doesn't really work in Dota, but you can't calculate it, so don't try to. Just go by feel and learn by intuition by doing the thing. And I think that again tends to be more fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, league players like definitely lean into knowing specifically like over time. They've made it more and more obvious like how much damage your smite is going to do against Baron, and then like made it really obvious how much health Baron has. So you're just looking for the number to be low enough, and like if smite were made to be random damage, the player base would revolt. I think that touches on Andrew's point about like when you create a game, you kind of set a ceiling for how much RNG you can have in it. It's really hard to add more after that point. Because player base just tends to hate it at that point because the people who like that amount of RNG.
The smite thing is
you can take it away though, right?
Yeah, but
I think if smite. Yeah, I think if Smite had a huge damage range, it would not be good. But I think it would be interesting to figure out how to boil that interaction down to not just a calculation where you're like where to take away the fact that you're just looking for a visual cue and then you're doing the thing, right? To have it be based on something else.
I do think in practice it is more interesting just because you have so many variables of other players throwing abilities and the bar is jumping and there's lag and whatnot. But to your point, I think you could make an interesting system with randomness there. It wouldn't be good to add it to League now, but if a League were being designed from scratch, potentially.
Yeah.
There's fun in threading that needle of when you hit the smite.
Another interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
Another interesting one that took me a while to figure out was that it makes, but it's kind of obvious in hindsight, it makes balancing so much easier when you have random damage. And the reason is that the matchups are very sharp and the granularity is very low when you don't have randomness. So let's say that a unit in StarCraft does 4 damage, which is, there's definitely units that do 4 damage, I think, at least, but not upgraded. If you change that to 5 or to 3, you're massively changing the matchup between another unit that does 7 damage but attacks less often or whatever. And you're literally changing the time to kill by a pretty large number, and it's really hard to find ways to change the time to kill by less than that. So you've sort of capped how much control you have over these matchups. But with randomness, of course, you can sort of get a lot more variety by making them do 5.2 damage a second. Now it's like, okay, this will not always go the same way, but generally this unit's going to kill this unit in 3 seconds or whatever. So you make that job much easier. But on the other hand, balance changes in StarCraft are super impactful. So there's some advantage to that too.
That is true. I guess even with the randomness involved, you can make balance changes more impactful, but I guess you run the risk of like making something too impactful. I think that is a big reason why that and the sharp matchups thing, but I think a lot of StarCraft or a lot of Warcraft players when they switched to StarCraft 2 when it came out, I think Grubby supposedly said this, was that it feels like a game with a lot of hard counters, right? Where a lot of matchups are extremely deterministic, right? I think that's sort of what it boils down to, is that this unit will beat this other unit and there's nothing you can do to make it not so. Whereas in Warcraft, again, because of the randomness in the attacking, but also many of the other factors, you can do a lot of other things like run away or whatever to sort of continue to utilize your units even if you're in a losing matchup, or you can find a way to win the matchup with play or with items or whatever that don't exist in StarCraft.
Yes,
The-
my lord.
I think
As you wish.
Yes. Oh, you should have done the intro in that voice. You should
For the
predict,
king.
say
That
Zug
takes
Zug.
me back for sure. Zug Zug, oh man.
Yes.
Zug, zug, yes.
I was such a fan of the things they would say when you kept poking them to stop
Yeah.
poking.
Why do you keep touching
As a
me?
kid, as a kid, I loved that shit.
Yeah. Whoa, he
there's
says
a
something
card-
different.
There's a card in Hearthstone, Ragnaros the Fire Lord. And I think that's a good example of how you can have randomness is the only way to have that effect be balanced, right?
What's the effect?
The effect is at the end of your turn, it deals 8 to a random enemy target, including its face.
More minions they
It's
have,
very
the more likely
powerful.
it is.
8.
Yeah. 8. What a huge number. Unbelievable.
Yeah,
So,
it ends up being a really interesting thing to play around
fuck.
because, like,
Yeah.
you need to have units on the board at that turn. When turn 8 comes around for your opponent, you need to just spread all your weenies out or whatever. So it's like, yeah, because it's a late game card, there's a lot of interactivity.
And I think the thing to consider as a designer is, okay, if you were to make this not random and make it targeted, you would have to nerf the card so much, right? It would have to do like half as much damage in order to be balanced, and it would play completely differently. Whereas
4.
Yeah, well, way smaller of a number. No fun for.
Yeah, Legends of Runeterra kind of lean more into that space of like we're going to make things more deterministic and sort of like less swingy, which is just a different game, but like arguably a worse one in some ways.
All right, I have a. Wait, do you have one more? You want to do one more? I think I was one, so you can do 2.
Just one.
Wait, I don't know. We don't have
quick,
infinite time here, so.
Yeah. So randomness could be secretly manipulated to make the player feel good or align with expectations. This is obviously dangerous because when the player finds out about that, they might feel undermined. But a good example of it, there's a couple examples. One is Civilization Revolution, I think. There was one version of it. People were just like complaining always about their like tank getting killed by spearmen because there was like a 5% chance that would happen. And so they literally,
Barbarian effect.
So they changed it so that anything 90% or above, I believe, actually is 100% under the hood if it's in the player's favor.
Oh, even though it says 90.
It says 90, but it's actually 100 because Sid Meier, among other designers, figured out that like it's more important to align with player expectations than it is to be right or like it is to do it correctly. And so another example is XCOM, very similar thing. But like XCOM, I think eventually made it so that if you have a 99, players hate when you're like literally right up next to the enemy and you shoot a point blank and it goes right over their shoulder or whatever. And so I think they changed it so it's like if it's 95 or more, 90 or more, then you always hit with that too. And like the player,
wow, that's a real change. Okay.
Yeah, I can't promise that one. Maybe that was just talked about, but I'm pretty sure in at least one version. That's it.
Do they ever talk? So when devs do this, do they talk about it or do they grudgingly admit it when they're found out, or they just are like?
Usually, I would say it comes out at like GDC, so it comes out to other devs more so than to players. It's not the sort of thing you want to tell people because again, it makes them feel even if you hit a 90% chance, you do feel like you're deserved. But you also feel like, oh, okay, nice, I didn't miss, because it's like really tense, right? You don't want to miss. You lose all that tension if they knew that it was guaranteed. So you have to be very careful. Generally, when game designers mess with randomness and make it pseudo-random, most of the time you don't want players to know. That said, often you do end up telling them because also you don't want to hide things from them necessarily. You don't want to deceive them. So like it's a tough line to ride.
Kind of build trust.
Yeah, I wonder.
Reminds me of a DM fudging a roll.
Totally. Yeah, it's a great example.
I don't know what that means. Is that D&D thing?
Yeah. When you're rolling for the monster move.
Oh, got it.
And you're like,
DMs roll behind the screen or whatever.
Yeah.
You just barely did it.
I wonder if those specific examples wouldn't have been fine if you just set it to 100%. Because to me, it's like if you're going to manually, but like visually as well. Because to me, I think the way I would think about that problem with the tank and the spearman is that like, okay, well, obviously the player expects that the spearman can't ever be the tank, but also that's your percentage that you're showing, your system that's doing the calculation should also not think that a spearman could ever be the tank, right? Like to me, I would think like, well, that's more of a issue with your auto battle calculation rather than the randomness itself.
So I'm going to answer this in a way that only makes sense for a PvE game like Civilization. But the reason you may not want to do that is because eventually the player is going to be the one with the spearman and the computer is going to be the one with the tank. And you want the player to have a 10% chance to win that because it feels so good when it happens and you get an
I
achievement or
see.
whatever.
Okay, that makes
Huh.
sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I had something else to say, but I don't remember. So.
Okay. Rapid fire. Encourages riskier play because bets can always pay off if you're lucky enough. This is kind of a corollary of the one where it's like randomness or variance allows weaker players to beat stronger players, but it also allows for riskier, more interesting choices to be made in gameplay because there's not deterministic like, oh, that's just a bad move like it is in chess. This is just the engine says that's bad. But in like
you
a
can
game
go
with
for
a lot of
Hail
RNG,
Marys.
you could try and kill that monster in Warcraft and hope to get the really rare drop that will turn the tide of this next battle, even though it's generally probably means you're going to lose.
So in chess there is this concept. It's called hope chess, and actually you might be surprised, but even this happens a lot even at the highest level. This is sometimes, especially when time is a concern, this is sometimes like the
steering
optimal
into
way
like
to play.
a non-well
Yeah.
understood board state.
Yeah, like you're muddling. Top players often talk about this, like you're muddling up the board state, or you're adding complexity to the board state. Even if it's objectively bad, you're counting on the opponent not being able to react. And I think adding that element to a game is also very important because you don't want the player to give up, right? Basically, like when they're in a losing situation, you don't want them to give up. You want them to keep playing, and to do that, you have to give them some way to hope that the outcome will be good.
Yeah, not optimal decisions, but I still have a chance.
You're optimizing for increasing complexity, which is really interesting. Yeah, that's cool because you know you're going to lose if you follow the predefined path, so you might as well add.
Hail Mary.
To that point, I mean, I already touched on this, but like games with variance and RNG are generally more fun for spectators to watch. I think like chess has actually, somewhat gotten into the mainstream on Twitch and things like that. But
very interesting, yeah. Why it has done so well suddenly, but
right, traditionally it's considered to be a poor spectator sport.
Yeah.
Do you ever play chess, Paul?
No, I think about it every once in a while, but then I think about everything I would need to do to become a good chess player, and it involves all that rote memorization that we're talking about, all the reasons not to have it, and so I don't.
You play sometimes now, don't you, Regal?
Yeah, I was actually grinding online chess for a couple of weeks recently. I've been like casually following for a long time, or like casually playing, but it's. I guess this is a bit of a long tangent. Why? But I think it has some unique advantages that make it really accessible. As crazy as that sounds, despite all the opening stuff, because of for one, you're able to win a lot of games in really exciting ways, even as a new player. And two, I think a lot of when you're new, the reasons you lose are not that you didn't know enough, unless you're very new. Once you reach like a sort of baseline where you understand opening principles to some extent, like you're 900, 1,000, which again is a bit daunting. That's like silver tier, and getting the silver is pretty hard. But once you're at a certain level, you're able to understand that like there were specific reasons you could hone in on why you lost. It wasn't like when you're losing in a fighting game against a much better player where you just felt you couldn't do anything. You were like, oh, I almost won. I made this one mistake that I can clearly point out, and then next time I just won't do that mistake because I was just stupid. And I think there are some advantages that make it surprisingly very approachable, much more than you might expect.
I never learned. I mean, I know how to play, but I never like looked into how to play. I know how the pieces move around.
Back in like high school, I was like kind of into it. I was definitely like, maybe could have followed a path where I made chess a big part of my life, but I did not. I went Magic instead. It was just more fun.
better art.
That's right. It definitely better art.
What kind of
what's your
decks
favorite
did you
deck?
usually roll with?
Gosh, I played a lot of like Madness in Odyssey. Okay. So like the Wild Mongrel sort of deck where I really like cheap spells and like casting a lot of them, drawing. Well, no, not exactly. Well, it needs to have like a twist to it. I would definitely not like a mono red player or anything. Definitely, I think my favorite deck is Goblin Charbelcher, actually.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
That gives you a sense. So
what is that?
Do you know about this deck in like Lorwyn era called All in Red?
In which game? Or
Lorwyn.
Oh, Lorwyn
I think it was whatever block was before Lorwyn. This deck was hilarious. It was one of the decks I encountered first when I first started playing on like Magic Workstation back in the day. But it sort of changed my mind about what kind of what kind of experience can be fun because it just plays all the rituals, and then there are these these two. The set had two like 5 mana cards, 5 mana like big fat red guys, and you just hope that you get your busted opening hand and then you instantly win, or you do nothing and lose. And it was great.
I was definitely the person who would have been testing that in FFL because I was actually I worked a lot on Lorwyn design team and then I was lead designer for Morningside. I was a big part of Magic design.
That was when I actually really got into Magic, like when I first like got my own cards and started playing. Actually, I have like the 2 decks I played the most in my life are probably Fairies and 5cc from that era.
Fairies was like I really wanted Fairies to be cool. I didn't design Bitter Blossom, but a lot of
you sure did succeed because Fairies were very dominant for a long time.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention earlier, way back when you mentioned the Mothership, there's an article on the Mothership that I wrote about trying to add purple to Magic. I made a really big push for adding a 6-color to Magic in a very specific situation, which was the Time Spiral block. That future site was all about the future of Magic. And so my idea was that we will build a world where we have added purple in the future, and we will make a set that has purple in it. And then that gives us an out to we don't have to continue making purple. It's just a glimpse into the future. And if it goes well, then we can actually make purple, which is what they ended up doing with a lot of random things in the future site set. But
interesting, huh?
Yeah. Actually, sorry, I'm wrong. I'm close to it. So I'm thinking of Planar Chaos. So Planar Chaos was pitched as an alternate present to Magic. So my thought was Planar Chaos will have an alternate present where there is purple. Future Sight will continue purple because it's Magic's future, and then we're done. So there was 2 sets that could support purple. And I like really pushed for it and had all these playtests where we tested purple cards. I designed a whole suite of purple cards.
What was the theme of purple?
That was one of the problems. It's hard. They do a really good job. The land was either cave or it was probably cave or like some
like
sort
an underground thing.
Yeah, it was definitely going to be like blue and black on the color wheel.
Uh-huh.
And then the theme was like time. Obviously, like Time Spiral and other things have done a lot of that now. But like, so it did things like it. And the other theme was like because it was so. It had a lot of aspects of blue and a lot of aspects of red. I guess it was like a counterspell that also deals damage would have been purple. Mana Drain was purple. The thought was like since purple is really hard to play. Yeah, we would have printed purple Mana Drain because purple is really hard to play, especially in limited. And in constructed, you're going up against deck colors that have years of cards, and you just have a set or 2 of them. So we thought that purple could actually be really strong because you'd have a very limited pool to draw from. And so we were thinking we would have printed PP Mana Drain or purple as an example.
Mana Drain is like destroying lands.
No, it's a counterspell. It's a very powerful counterspell that counters whatever your opponent wants to do and then takes all the mana they spent on it and you get it next turn. So it's like super savage for how much
it's only allowed in Vintage,
my friend.
which is it's banned in every format except Vintage, which is the oldest format for some context. Wow, okay.
That was my trap card.
That was one of the things that drew me to purple was that we could do these really powerful cards. And what we ended up doing for Planar Chaos was just taking existing rares and putting them in new colors, which I didn't find very interesting at all because the fun of drafting is evaluating new cards. And this was the exact opposite of that, where you're playing with a bunch of cards you played with before, just in new contexts, which was like cool, but not as cool as
I guess the one issue I could see is that the color play has no space, right, to add a new color.
It was tough.
Which I guess is exactly what you already mentioned. But that is a very interesting idea. I mean, I guess on some level they basically did that with colorless, right? Like colorless essentially at some point became a new color.
Yeah, that's true.
It got its own symbol, right? And you can't pay for it with colored mana.
Yeah, I think in a little way that was inspired by the purple experiment. Yeah, I think there's a mechanic that we were testing for purple that I think I actually still can't say because they still haven't used it. And like when I wrote the article, it's redacted. And like, I still can't say it because they may want to use it in the future. But there was a really powerful creature mechanic that like we probably couldn't have done on any other color, or it would have made the creatures really expensive and small. And so, yeah.
Are you going to get royalties?
No, just like in terms of their intellectual property.
Can you use it on your game?
No, I think they own the idea. So it was come up with that when I worked there.
Fuck.
Good old contract law.
Yeah.
Okay, I have. Let me run through the cons very quickly. You can react at the end just to save time. I'm guessing.
Sure.
I think I'll just say them all in a row. So these are Colin adding RNG to your game that came to mind. So it's harder to ease into the game and understand the strategy, especially at first, because the designer has less control over the situation, and sort of like things could be happening that are outside of what they wanted to happen, and so on. You can hopefully design around that, but like I think it potentially makes it more difficult to players to understand what's going on outside of the tutorial. It's obviously a lightning rod for complaints from top players and esports fans, as we talked about. Players feeling cut off from optimal builds, especially within rank systems. We talked about that.
Whoa, say that one more time. That was fast.
Players feeling cut off from the optimal builds, especially within rank
Mm-hmm.
systems. Harder for the designer to control the intended experience. So basically, like you might end up running into outliers that are difficult to reproduce and or fix. Like let's say someone just happens to roll 6 ones in a row on a 100-sided die. They're going to get into this state that's like really hard to recover from, and it's really hard to test it unless you have ways to like literally go into the game and like force die rolls to be a certain thing, which is a tool that you may or may not have because it's probably potentially tricky to build. And then potentially vulnerable to being gamed, especially if there's pseudo-randomness. On the other hand, I think that systems that can be gamed within reason often make players feel smart, which can work in your favor. Because if there's something the players love more than not feeling smart, it is feeling smart when they're playing your game. And so I actually think it's good to seed in ways where players feel like they're gaming a system in a way that is actually not breaking the economy. Or
can you give me an example?
I have an example.
Okay.
In the auto chess derivatives, I think TFT has this, although I'm not 100% sure, but the availability of a certain unit is determined by how many other people have that unit. So the more people have, I haven't played auto chess in forever, the more people have Zyra, theoretically, the smaller amount of Zyras appear in your pool. In practice, I think that basically doesn't matter, or it matters very, very little, right? But it makes players feel like they're strategizing or doing something by holding all these Zyras so that other people can't get them, even though in practice it makes a very small effect.
You also see players optimize around that when they're rolling deeply. Mm-hmm. They'll often buy units that aren't the unit they want just to hold them, because it increases the chance that they get the unit they want, especially in cases where it doesn't cost them money to do so. For whatever reason, I can't remember the exact mechanics, but I know there are some cases. And similarly, Hearthstone, like sometimes I'll buy like a unit that sells for exactly what it costs and then just hold it while I'm rolling to like dilute the pool a little bit and increase. But it's weird because like you're also increasing the chance that other people find their units when they're rolling, and so it's like it is a very small thing. But again, you feel smart even if you're not being that smart, which is the important thing. Much more, perception is reality. Especially,
I think it's very on the topic of feeling. On the topic of feeling smart, I think it's very important to have these sort of advanced strategies give like tiny edges rather than a significant edge, because then the new player doesn't feel like, oh, well, I guess some of them still do, but most new players, reasonable ones, don't feel like they're missing out or they're unable to win like in a fighting game, right? Because they're unable to pull off these sort of advanced strategies. They can just focus on what's important. But you also give the skill ceiling that makes a little tiny increase that makes experienced players feel like they're doing something.
I used to have a word for this, and it's not coming to me at the moment, but basically you want there to be like a player journey of understanding of the game and of skill, where they're understanding these really large concepts right in the beginning, and like those have a huge effect on what's going on. And then there are more and more nuanced little things that they can eventually get to when they're ready that give them smaller and smaller edges. But at that point, they want every edge they can get, and so they're still excited to find them. An example from the past is like Tiny Adventures, which is a very non-competitive game about just sending off your adventures onto quests, and for the most part you can't do anything while your adventures on the quest. You're just getting postcards about it, but you could change their items. So you could have them walking through the swamp or whatever, and they take off their plate mail and they put on leather, I intentionally designed a system which was pretty minor, but like was present, where depending on the type of terrain you're going through, you're more likely to get certain types of events. So let's say you're in the hills, you're more likely to get strength and dex events. You can still get COD events or whatever else, but you're more likely to. So the really savvy players who just wanted to play Tiny Adventures and babysit their character could swap their items as they get through different trains, depending on what the more likely events were. And they felt smart. And then often, sometimes, were paid off for it. And then every time you get an event that matches, you feel like you were smart, and like you feel like you made the right call, even though it may not have made a difference. Like you might have won anyway, but like you don't care about that. You just care about the fact that you did the right thing.
What was that?
For me,
go ahead.
I was gonna say, for me, I often get sucked into this this specific thing where I feel like I have to keep optimizing things because they're there for me to optimize, and that can sometimes actually reduce the fun I have in a game. Even if like consciously I know that it doesn't matter, I also know that it does matter, and so that sort of sucks me into trying to do these things from like a psychological standpoint. And I don't even know that's possible to avoid, but
Were you
Is
gonna
this
say
like a
something?
perfectionist thing or like an
yeah,
engineer thing?
yeah, it is an engineer thing.
Yeah, okay, real quick. Yeah, Backpack Battles 100% suffers from that because inventory management, they have so many things that you can optimize. Like, you can move your literal bags around that, like, there are things called fanny packs, which makes your items trigger 10% faster. But, like, in order to swap a fanny pack in, you have to take all your shit out of your bag and then rearrange your bags and put it all back. And, like, I'm pretty good at finding a point of diminishing returns where I'm like, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to queue in. If I win, great. And if I lose, it's probably not by enough where that would have mattered.
Are these
But
are these time
that's
things like your micro matters, or it's just like how much
no,
time I want to put into before my turn is over?
right. The clever thing about backup battles, I guess, I mean, it's pro and con, I guess, in this case, but like you have infinite time. You can wait 3 weeks and then queue because you're not paired against a specific set of other people. You're literally just playing against someone being pulled from the ether
Yep,
that existed before your time. So you can
And
take
I
as much
think
for as little time as you want.
an ancient one.
to your point, Swimfan, making these things timed is a good way to eliminate the need, the OCD sort of need to micromanage. Not that you should always do it, but that can be a very simple way to tell the player, like, hey, do what you can in this time, but then you can
Time to
stop thinking
go.
about it. It's out of your hands. Yeah.
Having
Yeah.
the timer allows Hearthstone Battlegrounds to have like very intricate, like comps, I guess, where you're generating infinite gold, which would be totally stupid if you had infinite time, obviously. But in the situation where there's a timer, it does have some drawbacks, like mobile players kind of get screwed and so on. But otherwise, it gets these like interesting hype moments where you're just doing crazy things, and it's also another good spectator moment when you see a streamer in that thing. You see Hearthstone Dog, a guy named Dog who plays a lot, who's just incredibly fast and precise. And like it's amazing to watch. Like, it's always great to also weave in ways for your top players to show off and do things that the normal player can't do. Another good aspect of like a successful esport or spectator mode, which is kind of hard to do in a turn-based game. So it's really cool that they found a way. I mean, and like they clearly like it because pretty much even they just overhauled Pirates, who are the most common infinite gold generators, and they left in a way to do it. So yeah, they like. I'm sure they're on board. Cool. Out of
You've reached the end.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so we're hitting 3 hours now, or so 3:15. So we
some of that was dead time, I'm sure, right? Copium.
Okay. What else did you have more on your outline you want to cover? On the
Me?
outline?
I have a lot, but we definitely not going to get through all of it. So
Okay.
it's up.
How are you doing, Paul? How
these
you
guys.
feeling? You ready to wrap it up, or you want to keep going?
We could do.
We'll wrap it up.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay. That's right.
No. What were you gonna say?
Okay, let's do one. I have one. I want to think about.
All right.
I mean, I do want to mention one thing about speedrunning RNG.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Which I will do right now. So we talked about how the RNG moments can make for big highs and lows for people watching or for people playing, and can, give me a chance to be first if I grind this RNG spot enough. But another thing with these speed runs is discovering ways to manipulate RNG, and this obviously takes us away from the whole concept of RNG. But for example, in the Quest for Glory series, these guys do a lot of code diving and just looking through, how the game is put together. And if they ever just find a way to control the RNG seed, we may base our whole run around that. Like, if we know we can get the world into a certain state, we may front load that and then go and do the hard thing that it enables, et cetera, et cetera. But it just makes for an interesting extra element for speedrunners, and like discovering essentially programming, like bugs, like programming mistakes. Like they found in Quest for Glory 4, there's basically an incorrect programming call to the RNG system, whatever you call it. And so it's just a bug that it sets it to this seed every time if you loot a revenant specifically. Anyway, so fun.
I think one of the downsides of that, so that happens a lot, especially in older games, especially in older console games. SNES games, I think, are particularly bad. And I think,
well, there's no patches, right? That's never going to get fixed, for one thing.
It's also a system limitation where I think the RNG at the hardware level is predetermined on reset. It's just a random string of numbers that is repeated in the same order on, I think, the SNES or maybe one generation before that.
Like there's an SNES wide RNG system, essentially.
Yeah. So like the game is calling, so the hardware, the computer is inside the SNES, right? And that's running the same routine that's generating the same stream of numbers. It may be one generation before the SNES. Anyway, this happens a lot in speedruns of like classic RPG games. And I think this is another good example of how deterministic outcomes can kill the fun in some ways, because there's these like 3-hour Final Fantasy 3 runs or whatever that follow a set RNG manip seed, and you have to make every movement in the entire game along the same path. And
there's literally like every step has to be is planned out.
Like step manip routes are infamous for this. And to get a world record, you have to do it through the whole thing, which is not fun, but also like tedious, right? And it's in that kind of context actually even more challenging because you can't. It's hard to make a rule set that says no RNG manip, because you can do it unwittingly, or you can do it wittingly, but say you did it unwittingly. It's like, oh, it's an accident. I just happened to walk in this little tile that, I
guess it depends how complicated it is, right?
Right.
Because we have some rules for some of the speedruns of our of Quest for Glory has no RNG manip allowed. So just for that reason, like we like the RNG.
Yeah, I think generally it's fun.
I think that's a good way to wrap this episode up. We like RNG generally.
Yeah, it's got its
Talk
place.
About
really
Critical
good place.
Strike another time.
We can tit on Critical Strike real quick.
Can we?
Maybe not. All right, maybe not. We'll move on.
We'll save it.
Okay. Paul, before we wrap up, is there anything you want to plug? Any Sottosanti themed games?
Not really. I mean, if you really want to check out something I've worked on, this board game Neom here is a game that's inspired by Seven Wonders, SimCity, and Carcassonne. Came out a few years ago. It's a game where you draft kind of a slightly futuristic city and plays pretty quickly with up to 5 players. But yeah, these days I've got a couple other board games in the works, and like I said, doing some contract work, but nothing I feel like
nothing you can talk about yet.
Yeah, not really. Nothing worth talking about yet.
Cool. That's the board game Neom, Neom, right?
Yep.
By Paul Sottosanti.
Yeah, themed after futuristic megacity that's being built in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, which is
the Neom, the line.
Is that happening?
I don't know. Yeah, supposedly.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I just saw a video on YouTube 3 days ago saying like update on the construction, so I haven't watched it yet, but I'm curious.
Yeah, we shall see.
Stay
tuned.
That's right.
All right, thank you everybody for listening. And here is a random song to close us out. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.